So that means we're friends, right? By Paisley Wraith. Read by Michelle of UAs-Art. He was bleeding. Bad enough it was seeping into Kyle's clothes. I wish you'd let me take you to a hospital, Kyle fretted. He looked over his shoulder again, making sure they weren't being followed. The men who'd thrown him into the street had just disappeared, for the time being. That was fucking scary. I told you to leave me, the man said, leaning so heavily against Kyle he was practically carrying him. You'll just be in trouble. I live around the corner, Kyle replied, bracing him as he stumbled. I'm not leaving you in the street. The vigilante groaned in pain, clutching his blood-soaked uniform. He was slowing down, and that frightened him. Lean on me all you need to, Kyle told him, fumbling for his keys in the dark, just in case they needed to get in quickly. We're almost there. Hold on a little longer. He slumped, and Kyle caught him. For someone he'd personally seen take down men twice his size, he was light. Mysterion? Kyle asked, alarmed, and the vigilante stirred. It's a waste of time, Kyle, the cloaked man mumbled. I don't know who's following me. You're bleeding in practically my front yard. I'm not abandoning you. Kyle snapped. The man smiled, twisted, and Kyle continued. So shut the fuck up already. My apartment is here, first floor, no stairs. It's okay. You'll be okay. The vigilante laughed in his ear, dark and mocking. You really aren't scared of me at all, are you? You've only been coming to me for help for almost a year now, Kyle said firmly as he unlocked the door. I only write about you in the paper all the time. I've seen what you can do, so no, you don't scare me. I should, Mysterion murmured. You make me sound nicer than what I am. Yeah, you just broke up a kidnapping ring last week. Not nice at all. Kyle tried to ease the bloody man onto his couch, and Mysterion flopped limply to his back with a grunt. Kyle moved to shut and lock all the doors first of all, then moved to his side immediately, green eyes snapping. Take off your shirt, he said, not leaving room for argument. I know you probably have a concussion, but I want to make sure you don't bleed out first. It's a one piece, Mysterion mumbled, leaning back against the pillows. Just leave me alone. It'll all end up okay. Not a chance, Kyle retorted. I need to check that cut. How'd you let that guy actually pick you up off your feet? Lucky. Mysterion sounded like he was slurring. Fucker. This wasn't getting anywhere. Mysterion's eyes were drooping, and Kyle gritted his teeth. How do I get this off? He asked, stooping down behind the couch. Mysterion! Kai. The vigilante breathed, eyes closing. Kyle's heart was racing. He grabbed the man's chin, getting in his face. Open your eyes! He demanded, and the vigilante obliged with a wince. You're letting me help you, or I'm calling an ambulance. Your fucking choice. I'm tired, not dying, Mysterion grumbled as he slowly reached under the top of his cloak, trying to pull. Kyle found a snap and detached the cloak, watching the hero grit his teeth as the redhead pulled the cloak off his shoulders entirely. A zipper, Kyle couldn't help but point out. The most feared man in the whole fucking city is running around in a onesie. Fuck off. Mysterion looked exhausted, but still pissed. He moved to help Kyle unzip the costume, which made Kyle just more distressed. No bulletproof armor? Nothing? Mysterion was pale, too. Pale and thin. He was lean, but he still didn't look like someone who could pick up the front end of a car. Dude, how have you not died already? Mysterion cracked a smile, something bitter and ugly, and it made him shiver. Kyle peeled his costume where it was sticking to his wound. He breathed in relief. Fuck, it's just bad road rash. He laughed, feeling flooding back into his fingers. Shit, you had me scared to death. thought maybe you severed an artery. Mysterion closed his eyes, settling back. In truth, there was one puncture wound. Kyle wondered how it had happened. He'd seen the guy pretty much lift the vigilante up and throw him into the fucking street. Into a car. His body had bounced off the car and skidded across the street and remained still. He'd just been watching. Mysterion had been in his neighborhood for some reason, and he'd watched him get hurt. Once the men had fled, Kyle stepped in before they could come back. You should have broke something, Kyle mentioned as he stood to get his first aid kit from under the sink. I can't believe you got off this easily. Mysterion smirked tiredly as he approached. He lowered his head again, letting Kyle work. There was a cut in the scraped-up skin, he noticed, as he started cleaning up the area. The vigilante never flinched. Kyle glanced up. Can you feel this at all? He asked. If he couldn't, that was a whole other issue. Yes. Mysterion sounded uninterested. It's fine. It was eerie. He never moved, never reacted. He was disinfecting the area, and it had to hurt like hell. Kyle watched his chest rise and fall as he worked on the skin. He had a thought, and it wasn't pleasant. You're not going to the hospital at all, are you? Kyle asked irritably. No. Great. Guess I'll do what I can then. Kyle cringed. I can use surgical glue, but your skin is fucked up, dude. You look like you fell into a meat grinder. Whatever makes you happy, Kyle, Mysterion replied. He sounded tired. I'll be fine. I've had worse than this. I heard you got shot downtown last week, Kyle said coolly, looking up at him again. I don't see any marks, though. Mysterion opened his eyes, watching, smiling. I told you, I always end up fine. Kyle met his gaze. He tilted his head, having a slow realization. Can you regenerate? Mysterion's answer wasn't a yes or a no. I know you talk more than this, Kyle said, leaning back from taping gauze over his worst scrapes. I interview you regularly. If a concussion is messing you up that badly, I don't have any useful abilities. Mysterion sounded more irritated than anything. I can fight. I bounce back quickly. That's it. Kyle decided there wasn't much more he could do for the massive bruising other than give him an ice pack. He pulled the blanket off the back of the couch over his chest, standing up. Mysterion was asleep by the time he got back from the fridge, and Kyle stared down at him. He could snicker over Kyle not being afraid all he wanted. This was bizarre. The most wanted hero in the state, sleeping on Kyle's couch as if he wasn't in any danger. He regularly showed up when Kyle asked him to, willingly shared information, even asked for help sometimes. He trusted him. Kyle crouched down next to him, watching his face, the twitching of his eyelids, his lips parted as he breathed, the mask half covering his face, dark paint over his eyes to disguise him, somehow. It was smeared, revealing pale eyelashes. Kyle reached without thinking, intending to cup his face. Mysterion jerked awake, reaching out to stop Kyle's hand, and ended up smacking him in the face instead. Fucking ouch! Kyle wasn't hurt as much as he was pissed. Bite the hand that heals you, I guess? Sorry, Mysterion mumbled, in such a different voice that it took Kyle by surprise. He almost commented on it when he realized what it must be. You can't sleep, Kyle said in concern. Don't fall asleep yet. I need to make sure you're all right. Mysterion seemed to shake himself. Right, his voice corrected. Yes. He looked exhausted, snuggling into the blankets like a child. Kyle smiled, confused. He turned this terrifying dark beast into something nearly cute. Mysterion was feared. He was vicious and unrelenting and remorseless. And here he was, curled, half naked on Kyle's couch, all bandaged up, under a fleece blanket. Kyle moved to sit down fully beside him, not quite sure what to do about the situation. He really wasn't equipped to treat medical problems. That gash in his chest worried him greatly. He did the best he could, but it was worrying. Do you... Mysterion looked up at him, and Kyle proceeded carefully. Have an identity. Someone you are when you aren't Mysterion. That quiet look turned electric. His eyes seemed to spark. Why? His growl was back, and he lifted himself up on one elbow. Lay the fuck down, you idiot! Kyle touched his shoulder, gently coaxing him back down. I just want to know if that persona could visit a hospital. I really think you should get someone professional to look at you. Mysterion eased back down, the fire leaving him, replaced by something just as warm, but not as intense. I do, he revealed. And if I say I think about it, will you drop it? That sounded nearly playful. Kyle's hand was on his shoulder. He slowly, curiously dragged his fingertips across the bruises there. For now, Kyle said finally, finding it surreal to be touching Mysterion so gently. He was allowing Kyle to run his fingers over the bear's skin. It shook him a little, that, and the tired way he was watching Kyle. He had snapped bones in half, sent the worst people running in terror, and here he lay quietly in his house, letting him fuss. The Jewish man smiled, tracing his fingers over his collarbone. Does anyone look after you? You're getting too personable, Mysterion warned quietly. We're not friends, Kyle. Kyle looked him over, looked around his living room, looked back at him. I'm not going to comment, he said finally. I'm getting something to drink. Water fine for you? I should go, Mysterion said, hoisting himself up. Kyle's hand immediately settled on his chest. Don't, Kyle said, serious. He met Mysterion's gaze, unafraid. If you're not going to a doctor, you're staying here until at least I know you don't have brain damage. Mysterion paused, seeming to think. You can't keep me here, he said, narrowing his eyes. I can't, Kyle agreed, but I can ask you that you don't leave yet. Here he paused. Kyle moved forward quickly. I'll worry about you. Something softened in the vigilante's eyes. And what makes you think I care? Kyle didn't shirk. You smile every time I say something like that. The smile immediately left Mysterion's face, eyes widening like he'd been caught. He sat up again, brushing Kyle's hand off and trying to pull on his uniform quickly. Hey, what are you doing? Kyle demanded, flushing. We both know why you care, and I can't give you anything. Mysterion spoke quickly, jaw clenching as he tugged the cloth back over his wounds. Kyle, I can't, Kyle. I've let this go on too long. This is all my fault. Wait. Kyle's voice was weak, feeling cold from head to toe. What? Don't, what do you mean? You know exactly what I mean. Mysterion whirled on him, body shivering under the stress. His eyes were wild, with something that looked like fear. You're infatuated with the idea of me, something you can hail and regale as a hero, and I'm not. I'm nothing like you think. You shouldn't have ever gotten this close to me. This is the last time you're going to see me. It has to be. So, he did know. He actually knew, and he had never fully admitted it to himself. Kyle felt humiliated. His hands were shaking, but he stepped into his space anyhow to fight. He wasn't some fragile violet. He wasn't going to win this by embarrassing him. Now wait, he stammered, trying to wrap his mind around this. He couldn't leave. You're not giving me enough credit. I know what you've done. I've documented most of it. And yet you're still trying to paint me as a hero, Mysterion argued back, holding the spot in his uniform with dried blood crusted into it. He had to be agitating the cut. Because I truly believe you're acting from a good place, Kyle snapped back. And I never once debated asking you for anything. It's not fair to throw that at me. How dare you? Mysterion gritted his teeth, saying nothing. From what I know of you, I think you're just scared, Kyle accused, snarling up at the man. You shy away from anything that might make you think you aren't the heartless, menacing being you seem to be trying to convince yourself you are. You're terrified of anything that might change your mind, to make you think you might somehow end up being human after all. I'm not scared, Mysterion said slowly, staring. Yes, you are. Kyle's voice was ice. I've seen the things you do. You don't have to be Mysterion, but you are. Despite putting yourself in danger near daily, taking risks to pick up where the law drops off, or bringing peace to people with no answers, that's not good. That's not selfless. I am very selfish. Mysterion's voice was low. I'm glad you came to me, Kyle said, eyes fierce. Whatever you think you are, you deserve protecting. You deserve help. I wouldn't ever act on anything, but don't leave. Not if you don't have anywhere else to go. Mysterion's gaze raised, slowly, lips parted, something startlingly intense in his eyes. He slowly reached up, cupping Kyle's face. He looked at him, expression shockingly vulnerable. If you were in my place, you would have definitely been a hero, Mysterion said, voice unwavering but soft. You'll be an incredible lawyer, Kyle. Don't. Kyle was about to say, and Mysterion leaned in. He kissed him, slow and firm, making Kyle melt. Gloved fingers caressed his cheeks, deepening the kiss as Kyle slid his hands around his neck. Immediately, Mysterion let him go, breathing against his lips. Goodbye, Kyle. The vigilante pressed one more kiss to his lips, and he was out of Kyle's arms before he could do anything more than swear at him. Mysterion wasn't bluffing. Kyle did not speak to him again after that. He saw Mysterion on the news, wrote about him some, before he had to go back to school and leave reporting behind him for now. He tried to puzzle it all together. Mysterion, he felt, was a good person. Someone devoted to protecting and helping, no matter what the reason behind it. And somehow, he felt, he cared about Kyle as well. He simply felt he didn't deserve things like that. Hospitals, help, affection, praise. No one should think like that. And Kyle wished he'd had the opportunity to say so. He hoped he had someone else to go to if it wasn't him. The redhead walked down the stairs into the warm spring weather after another lecture on criminal justice. He had just about begged Mysterion not to leave. How humiliating. Kyle grimaced as he shouldered his way through a gaggle of kids, not paying attention to where they were blocking. After about a year of him going to Kyle for help, he'd gotten attached enough to make a fool of himself. Or did he? If Mysterion was moved enough to kiss him goodbye, he should probably try and forget it. But Kyle tended to overthink things on a regular basis. How was this any different? He didn't want to just let it go. Not when he wasn't even sure how someone, yes, he considered a friend, might be faring. If he was okay. Some nights, if he was even alive. Hey, sorry, someone said, and Kyle glanced over. The student was tall, blonde with bright blue eyes that seemed to spark as they watched Kyle. He wore a loose red t-shirt and a backpack patched up with duct tape on the strap. Not that his ragged appearance attracted from anything. A smile spread over his face, warm and vibrant, and Kyle's heart leapt for some stupid reason. Can you show me where this building is? The boy asked sheepishly, still smiling at Kyle. I think I got turned around. Well, there's only giant signs telling you which building is which, Kyle couldn't help but saying, taking the map from the boy with a laugh. He smiled as well, delighted his teasing had been taken well, looking the map over. Sure, that's where I'm heading next. I'll show you. Kyle grew used to the ragged kid. His name was Kenneth McCormick, Kenny to anyone who knew him. He was Kyle's age, attended the same university, and also had a younger sibling. He liked bad jokes and singing off-key, had a strange personality that bordered between too quiet and too obnoxious, and was a student of forensic science, which Kyle considered seriously fucking cool. Kenny was bright, cheerful, kind of an asshole, and just seemed to fit himself into Kyle's life as neatly as anything. At first, Kyle had been wary. He wasn't a stranger to being hit on, and some people really took it to extremes. But Kenny never took it a step too far. They walked to class together. They actually had a few they both attended. And more often than not, Kenny would end up studying with Kyle in the university library. Weirdly enough, he never remembered Kenny inviting himself, or Kyle inviting him. He just sort of fit. Like now, for example, as he scribbled down notes in a truly atrocious handwriting, chewing on his lips rather adorably, as Kyle took a glance at him from across the table. Yesterday, Kyle had prodded into Kenny's past to learn his sister was named Karen. She was a major in design, and Kenny loved her more than anything in the world. Kyle liked Kenny. Kenny was smart, even if he acted like he was a dumbass. He was driven and kind and genuinely friendly. He was a dork, and had a bit of a wild sense of humor for Kyle's taste. This kid was different. Kyle had never clicked with someone like this. Felt like he'd always known Kenny. There was an air of familiarity around him that made him feel comfortable. Kenny glanced up, a concerned expression curving into a smirk as he noticed Kyle staring. Kyle looked back down, but it was already too late. Kenny was grinning, bright enough to light the city itself. "See anything you like?" he teasingly flirted, earning a kick from Kyle. "Hey, ouch!" "Don't be an ass," Kyle said absently, hoping his face didn't look as hot as it felt. Sometimes Kenny was too comfortable. He probably shouldn't feel this okay with kicking someone he'd known for only a handful of weeks. Kenny tissed his tongue, taking a swing of whatever sugary strawberry abomination he'd ordered from the campus Starbucks. Kyle wrinkled his nose. Kenny always noticed everything. "Don't make that face at me," he said, eyes twinkling. "Mr. Boring Tea. I would have at least pegged you for a coffee guy myself." Kyle wrinkled his nose further, making Kenny snort. "No," Kenny said, ticking something off in his notebook. Kyle hoped it wasn't some weird list of things he liked. "Yeah, there was this small-town coffee shop where I lived that pretty much ruined coffee for me. Forever." Kyle tried not to think of it. He moved away and honestly would be glad never to go back. Just bad memories left now. "Where did you live?" Kenny asked, resting his chin on his hands as Kyle continued taking diligent notes. "I kind of moved around a lot. I grew up in this little hick town called South Park," Kyle said, a wry smile on his face. "It's a weird little place. Not far from here, but far enough." Kenny was looking at him strangely, eyes narrowing. Kyle met his gaze, arching an eyebrow, waiting. "I was born there, actually," he said, and Kyle set down his pen. "No way," he said staunchly. "I would have remembered you." Kenny's grin grew into something almost manic. "Oh, would you?" he asked, and Kyle's face turned red. The blonde seemed to enjoy that for a second before lifting a shoulder. "I was sent into foster care with Karen when I turned 8. I was bounced around till I aged out." "Oh, shit." Kyle didn't know what to say to that. "I'm sorry." Kenny shrugged again. "It's not so bad. The families that had us were nice. We had a lot of friends. It wasn't horrible. But you've never heard of the McCormick family in South Park." "I moved there when I was 11, Kyle said, racking his brains. "We'd lived on the East Coast beforehand. I don't remember." He'd remember. He'd definitely remember. "Where did you live?" "Right across the train tracks," Kenny recalled, chewing on a pencil. "Between the forest and the first road to town from the bus stop." "You're kidding," Kyle said, alarmed. "That's our house." Should he be worried? This was getting creepy. Kenny drew the word out, smiling crookedly. "I doubt it, man. I'm not talking about an actual house. We lived in a shack right next to the forest. We were literally right next to the tracks." "You mean the Kyle bit himself off from saying junkyard in a bewildered tone. That place had a shack on it, sure, but it would be a stretch to call it habitable. "Yep." Kenny looked back down at his paper, a slight pink coloring his cheeks. That place. Well, no fucking shit then, no wonder he'd been taken away. Kyle searched for something, anything to say that didn't involve his opinion of how awful that was, or how someone like Kenny didn't belong there. Someone so sunny and vibrant among filth and emptiness. Were you and Karen able to stay together? He asked. Kenny brightened as he did whenever his sister was mentioned. We were actually, he said, a faraway kind of look on his face. She refused to leave me. It made it harder for her, I think. She probably would have been adopted quick. She's smart, cute, sweet. I was kind of a roadblock. But, he said, whirling his pencil in his hand, we managed. She's in school, I am too, and everything's fine. She lives off campus even, with a roommate. Kyle digested all that. Kenny was smart, cute, and sweet in his own right. But the thought of that made his stomach churn. Instead, he went back to writing. Still, that's crazy. South Park. It's a shame we weren't there at the same time. Kyle mentioned getting Kenny's attention. Hell yeah, he said, cheering up. It would have been cool to be friends. Yeah, Kyle said, staring blankly at the next paragraph. He could see it. Kenny's laid-back personality and kind of raunchy humor, next to Kyle's biting sarcasm and short temper, would have been a nice match. He hadn't had a lot of friends in school, a handful of enemies. Being the weird northeastern Jewish kid meant a lot of people went after him for an easy target, but he'd gotten used to beating the shit out of other people. It would have been nice to have Kenny around. Kyle couldn't quite bring himself to say it. Instead, he tapped Kenny's textbook, bringing his attention back to it. The boy rolled his eyes, leaning over but keeping his gaze on Kyle. So, he said, and the redhead lifted his eyes to meet blue. I was reading your review in the paper today before class. I liked the way you word things. For some reason, that made Kyle blush. I used to write for a real newspaper. Kyle brushed the compliment off, feeling flustered. As an actual reporter, not just a school newspaper. Yeah? Kenny looked interested, leaning forward on his elbows. Like real reporting? What was it like? It was a lot of fun, he said, a reluctant smile curving his lips. Honestly, I'd love to major in it. I was lucky. I was just an intern at first, but he caught himself. He never told his classmates, or even his family, but now he was about to jump straight in. Kenny was still watching, though, with two blue eyes and fascination. But, he prompted gently, voice softening in encouragement. Kyle shrugged his shoulders. I had a run-in with one of the heroes of the city, he said, biting the inside of his cheek. And, I don't know, they trusted me a little, and they spoke to me regularly. Whoa, whoa, whoa! Kenny made a timeout motion with his hands. That is way too fucking cool to talk about casually. What hero? Part of the duo Wonder Strike and Super Strike? The Coon? First of all, fuck the fucking Coon. That's not a hero. Kyle said, eyes twitching, as he recalled the stories he'd been told by the one person he knew who had met the guy personally. And I met Mysterion, actually. Kenny looked at him oddly. Kyle, Mysterion isn't a hero. Kyle pointed his pencil directly at the boy. I have at least 7 articles I can recall off the top of my head to argue. I've been there personally for a lot of it. He's done more for the city than anyone gives him credit for, but because he hides in the shadows, people have this preconceived notion that he's not a good guy. He uses excessive force, Kenny pointed out, looking uncomfortable, like breaking spines and shit, and he never works with the police. Which is why, if you have to be technical, Kyle said, rolling his eyes, he's a vigilante. But remember, I knew him, personally. His heart is in a genuinely good place. He's one of the heroes, more so than the Coon at the very least. Shit. Kenny seemed to digest this, tapping his pen against his chin. Were you friends? He asked, sounding genuinely curious. Kyle hesitated. Everything he didn't want to think about rushed back. The moment in his living room, Mysterion bleeding and falling asleep on his couch, snuggling into one of Kyle's blankets, kissing him and telling him he'd never see him again, and then never talking to Kyle again. It's not that easy, he said, staring out one of the large windows. "He doesn't talk to me anymore." Kenny said nothing, and Kyle tried to gather himself back up, shut the door on everything he'd felt, every ounce of hurt and humiliation he had encountered. "So, do I have to, fight this guy for your affection or something?" Kenny's teasing voice made Kyle choke on his own tongue, whirling to see the boy grinning on him. "No!" he said, face flaming. "It wasn't like that." Kenny laughed, almost louder than Kyle's exclamation, having to smother himself in his jacket sleeves. They were both going to be thrown out of the damn library in a second. Kyle watched him irritably, and then the words clicked. "Fight for your affection. Hold the fuck up." Kyle's irritated, embarrassed gaze turned analytical. That was definitely not platonic. Well, Kenny flirted a lot, for fun it seemed, and flirted a whole lot with Kyle. Sometimes blatant, like awful, cheesy pickup lines before they walked into the Starbucks together, drawing flirtatious smiles in class on pieces of paper he shoved into Kyle's notebook, or subtle, how he liked how Kyle wrote, or how he openly called Kyle the smartest kid in the class, or the soft kind of smiles he sent his way. Kenny flirted a lot. He thought it was all for play. Maybe not. That was an odd way to word a tease, when literally anything else would have worked. He could have teased Kyle about his relationship with Mysterion without bringing himself into the mix. God, his face had to be so red now. So, what if Kenny meant it? Kyle focused on everything he felt. The things that came to mind were purple. A strong, lean figure who turned slowly over his shoulder to glance at Kyle. The fragile trust of someone who was always on the run. Shadows on the rooftops, a fleeting figure in an alleyway, strength and grace and power. The feeling of a body leaning over him for support. Utter and whole faith that Kyle wouldn't let him down. Chapped lips, purposeful and strong. Those things were fleeting. Kyle switched from day to night in his mind. Soft smiles, easy laughter, genuine interest, good-natured teasing. A lifetime of responsibility and strength of a different sort. An easy, comfortable friendship, interested in Kyle and Kyle alone, not as an informant or a smart kid, but as Kyle. Irritable, tired student worrying Kyle, who found him smart and funny and injected himself into Kyle's life and settled there so comfortably his absence would already be felt. Something promising, strong. Kyle closed his eyes, summoned the dark figure in his mind, and let go. For someone he could be sure of a friendship from. "Do you want to go out sometime?" Kyle blurted, and Kenny's head shot up from his book. "What?" he said quickly, with a somewhat frantic look. Oh God, had he read that wrong? Kyle froze. "Would you like to go get dinner or something? With me?" he asked bravely. He didn't have overly long to angst over it. Kenny was turning red himself. "Yes," he answered, suddenly sounding meek. Yes, yep." Kenny's stammering eased Kyle's nerves, and the boy grinned, face still colored. "Good," he said, hiding his smile in his palm as he propped up his chin. "Pick a night. I'll take you on a date." Kenny was silent, slowly pulling his shirt collar up to cover his lips, like he was trying to hide. Kyle tried not to laugh. Hadn't expected that, had you, asshole? He shouldn't feel this elated, right? Kyle tried to dredge up any feelings of regret, and found barely a sliver. Mysterion was a fantasy, a mask with someone behind it he'd never truly know, or ever befriend. Kenny was real, tangible, with the same kind of morals Kyle admired, the same strength, selflessness, cleverness, just in someone real, not someone who existed on almost a different plane, cloaked in mystery and shadow, but a kid who grew up in the same town, who took care of his little sister, and went to the same school. Real! It was time to put that fantasy behind him. They studied for the rest of the hour in relative silence. Kenny in an amazed sort of delight, and Kyle with a comfortable, relaxed sort of happiness. Kyle turned over his paper once he was done writing, resting his chin in his hands afterwards. They'd get to compare ideas with a partner once everyone was done. Normally, this was the reason for him to hate this kind of in-class assignments, but he really lucked out with partners in this class. He glanced at Kenny, who chewed on his pencil as he read over what he'd scribbled out. The concentrated, thoughtful expression was cute on him. He didn't get to see him focus that often. Kyle looked over the rest of the class, not even half done yet. Next to him, Kenny added more words to what he already had, underlining something twice. The kid loved psychology, and with Kyle's law degree and Kenny's criminology, both were required not only to take this, but a couple sociology classes as well. It was nice to have someone around. Kyle hadn't realized how isolated he'd become since he moved away from home. Kenny was good company. Kyle found it was kind of difficult to feel lonely with a bright ray of sunshine constantly attached to your hip. Said boy leaned slightly to reach Kyle's paper. The boy arched an eyebrow at him as he drew a crooked, sad little heart in the corner. Kenny grinned, pleased he had his attention. He slid his paper over to Kyle, despite the teacher not telling them to exchange papers yet. Kyle went along with it, feeling just a bit smug he was starting to recognize the reasoning behind the actions when it came to the blonde. Kenny got bored in class easily and started to lose interest the moment things got too quiet or people derailed the conversation. Kyle believed Kenny was incredibly smart, despite his protests that his grades were only so-so. As long as the teacher was talking about something that interested him, Kenny paid rapt attention and recalled information. Honestly, Kyle spent a little too much time in class analyzing Kenny, as much as the study material, but he couldn't quite make himself quit. Kyle looked over his thoughts on the excerpt they read, Kenny's analytical and careful commentary, focusing on environmental factors as influences. He was a big believer on nurture over nature, someone's upbringing and localized environment over genetic factors or predispositions. Kyle read over it, marking points he wanted Kenny to talk over or explain. This kid was so smart. He had an outlook on things that fascinated Kyle. This entirely negative outlook, and yet, Kenny's disposition made him constantly move on, rather than linger. Kenny was a believer that most people were not good people, yet he constantly gave people second chances, or the benefit of the doubt, almost contradictory to what he said. Kenny was fascinating, a vibrant, sparking personality, the sun itself in Kyle's palm. He could not be more thankful that he'd lost his way the first day of class at the beginning of the semester. It gained him a date, eventually. A few dates. The funny thing about that, Kyle had once resigned himself to be alone forever. He didn't look for anyone, particularly after meeting Mysterion, which he had lately refused to think about. Kenny snuck up on him, offering genuine friendship, never pushed, and let Kyle make the decision himself. He didn't think he'd ever fallen for someone this quickly before, as if he'd known Kenny for ages. He just fit into his life perfectly. He was still musing on that idea during lunch, when he took the cold day to sit outside in the sunlight, overlooking the campus outside the main building. The restaurant inside had a balcony, and considering the chill in the air, no one else was even out there. Someone kissed Kyle on the top of his head from behind and set his lunch down in front of him. Kyle smiled up at Kenny, having already gotten their drinks before sitting down. The blonde plopped into the seat next to him, looking out to the football field. "You look deep in thought," Kenny said cheerfully, attacking his sandwich. "What about?" "Just spacing out," Kyle said, not about to rattle off everything he'd been thinking about him. They weren't that far into the relationship yet. This thing had only just started. Let's not scare Kenny off before they'd even been together 2 weeks. "You work tonight?" "Yep," Kenny said, relaxing into the back of his chair. "As usual." "Oh," he said, sitting up so abruptly his chair made a horrifying squawk against the concrete. "I forgot to tell you, Karen got into her program." "The design thing you were talking about last week," Kyle recalled, enjoying the way Kenny lit up. A smile curved his lips. "That's awesome! You said she'd been trying for 2 semesters now to get in. She's worked really hard, he said happily, tucking back into his sandwich. She deserves this. She's so excited. Kyle's smile nearly split his face. Karen was the center of Kenny's universe. The boy worked twice as hard to support her, inverting every expectation of him, just to prove to his sister that no matter what someone might say to you, they could overcome where they came from. Kenny was beyond cool. Kyle had a thought suddenly. I've never seen Karen before, he said, taking a bite of his chicken sandwich. Have a picture? Course, Kenny said, reaching into his pocket for his phone. He scrolled through his library before turning his phone around and sliding it over to Kyle. The girl had brown eyes and brown hair, differing from her brother, but there was something similar in her face. In the smile, the slope of the face, the way they looked at the camera. Kenny's arm was around her, and Karen was leaning into her brother's hug, beaming. Kyle smiled. You can tell you're related, he mentioned, looking over the picture. She looks very sweet. She's a good kid, Kenny said fervently. She thinks you're cool. Well, I'll forgive her for her bad judgment, Kyle said, smiling as Kenny choked on his sandwich. Careful, he mentioned, trying not to laugh himself. Cool or not, at least you've got a sense of humor. Kenny congratulated him. Kyle rolled his eyes with a smile. He pulled his phone out as well, bringing up a recent picture of his baby brother. That's Ike, he said as Kenny interestedly took the phone. That's the day I graduated. He's just a kid and kind of an asshole, but he's great. You said he was smart, Kenny recalled. Must be a prerequisite of being a Broflovsky. You ended up with the redhead genes, huh? Unfortunately. Kyle had long since resigned to being a ginger. But Ike's actually adopted. He became my brother when he was just a baby. That's cool, Kenny mused, eyes crinkling in a smile. He sent Kyle a sideways, affectionate look. And redheads are cute, Kyle. Kyle kicked him, not near enough to actually hurt, turning red in the face as well as the hair. I'm not fishing for compliments, Kenny, he awkwardly assured. He didn't mean to sound desperate or something. Kenny's smile warmed into something genuine, and I'm not saying anything that's not genuine. Kyle's face felt hot. Kenny looked back at the picture again, handing it over when it switched to another picture. Simply Kyle during the morning graduation pictures with his family. Kenny quickly took it back. Hey! Kyle protested. I've never seen you in a suit. Kenny batted his hands away as he whistled, eyes twinkling as he teased. Look at you. You're one handsome bastard, Kyle Broflovsky. Shut the fuck up, Kyle hissed, covering his burning cheeks with his hand. That was the wrong thing to say. Kenny's smile turned into a smirk. Oh, God. I saw you for the first time, and I thought to myself. Kyle covered his face. Kenny, please. What a damned sexy boy. Kenny gestured to his phone, expression serious and eyes sparkling. Intelligent and looks and a fire? Yum. I'm going to pitch you over the balcony. Kyle groaned from inside the sanctuary of his hoodie. They can pick you up off the football field. Kenny's seriousness was breaking. He started to giggle. Come on, Kyle, you know you're hot. I hate you, Kyle grumbled, lips twitching into a smile. No, you don't. Kyle felt his phone slip under his hands. You think I'm cute, too. There, a switch flipped. Kyle's heart jumped. Kenny! This was getting embarrassing fast. Kyle lifted his head, face red, teeth grit, and Kenny's expression changed. Oh, the blonde suddenly looked almost scared. Fuck, Kyle, I'm sorry. It's fine, he said, shoving his phone back into his pocket with ferocity. Kenny reached for his hand, squeezing it. Kyle reluctantly glanced at him. No, I'm really sorry, Kenny apologized, looking distraught. I forget, you're not really used to me yet. I just feels like I've known you for longer than I have, I guess. Something flickered over his face briefly. I get too comfortable. Kyle's face was on fire. It's cool, it's fine, What, do I come off as desperate or something? Kenny snorted at that, coughing to cover it up. No, you don't. He picked up the hand he was holding, placing a kiss on it. I was the one after you, don't forget. If any of us was desperate, it was entirely me. You can make fun of me for it. I'll pass. Kyle just wanted to stop talking about it. This was bringing up memories, and it made him feel a little sick. Kenny was watching him oddly, carefully letting go of his hand. He looked genuinely upset, which made Kyle feel worse. I'm really sorry, Kyle. Stop. He didn't want Kenny kicking himself. Look, it's just, I've been stupid before. I don't really like talking about it. The analytical part of Kenny switched on. Kyle saw it as obviously as a physical swap. Blue eyes narrowed, oddly enough making his stomach swoop. I doubt you were ever stupid, he said, seeming to choose his words carefully. But this have something to do with your villain boyfriend? He's a vigilante, Kyle hissed, heart picking up. His hands felt clammy. And if I say yes, will you leave it alone forever? Kenny watched him, brows furrowed. If you were interested in him, he said cautiously, he probably would have thought himself a lucky weirdo, Kyle. You're incredible. The Jewish student exhaled shakingly. He stopped talking to me because I was stupid. What? Kenny blurted, incredulous. No. Look, you have no idea what happened, Kyle said, words tumbling over themselves in frustration. He was hurt. I helped him home. He said I wasn't acting professional, and he left. Well, fuck that guy, Kenny said, alarmed. That's on him. No. Kyle dragged his hands over his face. He knew I liked him. Infatuated was the word he used. Just wanted to help. He didn't seem to have anyone. He was hurt. I thought we were friends. He humiliated me. And then he kissed me. Kenny was quiet. Oh God, Kyle wanted to die. He poised himself, uncovering his face with such determined ferocity that his hand slapped the table. I'm sorry, that's probably not what you want to hear. Kyle struggled to think of what to say to someone he was dating-ish when he mentioned kissing the city's heroes. Kenny, however, looked determined. That in no way makes you look desperate or weak or anything. He interrupted Kyle with ferocity. Kyle stared. You're allowed to like people, Kyle. I know you. You'd never take advantage of someone or push them into something they wouldn't want. If he embarrassed you, that was just him being a shitty person. That has nothing to do with how you felt. Let me finish, Kenny said when Kyle tried to interrupt. Please, sweetheart. The endearment caught Kyle off guard. His mouth closed. He wasn't sure how to feel about that. I can picture you so easily, being some kind of informant or help, and assisting a hero in whatever tasks they have. What I absolutely know is that whatever went down wasn't your fault. He was a jerk for embarrassing you, and the fact he kissed you before disappearing? Kenny shook his head, looking back over the football field. That was a dick move. One he has to be seriously regretting. How much of a jackass do you have to be to point out an innocent feelings of a friend, take advantage of that person by kissing them, then disappearing from their life altogether so you think it's your fault? That's awful, Kai, but that's not on you. Kyle was rendered speechless by Kenny's insight. His pendant for the human mind again analyzing Mysterion this time. He went over the words for a while, quiet. He said we weren't friends, Kyle admitted, trying to find one last fault in Kenny's argument. You probably saved lives on hundreds of occasions with that man, Kenny said, oddly cool. You were at least his friend. Why else would he kiss you? Kyle didn't have an answer to that. He'd never been able to come up with a satisfactory, logical reason. He liked you, Kenny thought to himself. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense. You aren't desperate and have nothing to be embarrassed about. Mysterion is an asshole. Not you, not at all. You're allowed to like someone, Kyle. That doesn't make you desperate. What if it were me? He shrugged, lifting a hand. If I liked you, and you pointed out to me, threw it back in my face, told me I wasn't acting professionally for just being nice to you, does that make me desperate, or you an asshole? Kyle took a moment to digest that. Kenny let him, leaning against the table, barely brushing Kyle's elbow. You know. The taller boy's smile was back then, replacing the quiet, irritated look. Makes sense you'd work to make the city a better place, actually. I think you'd actually be a really great hero. Smart, sharp-witted, genuinely good-hearted. Not holding out any secrets on me, are you? No, Kyle said, somewhat dazed. Oddly enough, that actually made him feel better. To hear that he wasn't crazy. That wasn't normal behavior. It was kind of nonsensical. Dark purples and grays were imprinted in his mind. But they didn't cause the same panic they had previously. The crushing weight around his ribcage eased. Not that he still didn't feel embarrassed. He started, and then changed his mind. Thank you, he said instead, awkwardly. Kenny smiled. I know that was kind of a weird topic to throw at you. Not at all, Kenny said genuinely, and reached for Kyle's hand. If something's bothering you, I'd like to help if I can. We're boyfriends at this point, right? He checked with Kyle, who nodded slightly, flushed but pleased. So don't worry. Practically in the job description. Listen to problems, even if they contain stories of asshole superhero exes. Oh, shut up, Kyle said, but no venom was in it. Kenny leaned over to kiss his cheek. Okay, maybe he hadn't been at fault for the whole fiasco. He was only trying to help after all. He was worried about him for ages afterwards. He still checked the media to make sure he was okay. Sightings of him were still reported and such. Kyle gently tugged Kenny back to press a kiss to his lips, leaving the blonde looking surprised, but delighted. He was kind of surprised Kenny was so okay with this all, but it was a little relieving. He took that in stride. Thanks, Ken, he said, and Kenny more or less nuzzled up against him. The blonde kindly switched topics back to a safer one, their siblings and ridiculous stories of being kids. Kyle leaned to his side, feeling lighter than he had in ages. Maybe he could start to leave this behind now. One thing that was easier to leave behind for certain was the reason for Mysterion to be throwing things in his face. Leaning against Kenny, Kyle found it hard to believe Mysterion was even on the same level. Yes, he was a hero. Strong, powerful, resilient, and good. But so was Kenny. And Kenny didn't mind vulnerability. Kenny brought cheer and jokes and lifted Kyle out of something that had been bothering him for months. All because he cared about Kyle. Because he didn't like him thinking badly about himself. Kyle listened to his chatter, fingers entwined with Kenny's. Kyle was no stranger to the world of superheroes. Ever since he'd moved, he'd become attentive to the rise of people with powers or pronounced abilities. The city seemed to be where they all gathered, either to meet others like them or to fight. When two ultra powers held a duel, the city more or less ran for cover. Before they became a duo, Wonder Strike and Super Strike had a major clash 2 days before the new year. It was very unevenly matched. Wonder Strike was an elemental, and Super Strike was a low-tier brawler. The only thing that kept Wonder from outright winning was his inability to properly control his powers. It ended in more or less a draw, with minor damage done. Afterwards, people began to see the two similarly named heroes milling around together, before officially declaring themselves two parts of a team. Wonder Strike, almost magically, seemed to harness his powers into something fierce, and the other seemed to gain some sort of odd connected power to the other boy. People whispered that it went deeper than a platonic team-up, but Kyle left that to the mud rakers down the gossip columns. He reported on the fight itself. It had been the first hero brawl he'd ever seen on his own. They weren't all that common. Some picked more fights than others. Most left each other alone or amicably teamed up. Mysterion, for one, was never part of that. He had minor spats with some of the others, but never a full-on fight. No life or death shit. Both Super and Wonders were heroes in their own right. Kyle wasn't even sure Mysterion had ever met them. He certainly didn't think much about it, certainly not recently, until the campus went on lockdown the moment he pulled into the parking lot. Parking in one of the science building's green parking spaces reserved for high-efficiency vehicles, Kyle was close enough to the university dorms to see kids leaving in droves, many quickly being shooed back to their homes by campus police. Alright, probably safe to say he wasn't going to be late for class. Kyle didn't get it at first. Uncertain and somewhat terrified, he opened his phone searching for news of a fire or something. The campus police looked too bored for it to be anything truly awful, and the kids were actively trying to look at something. Kyle searched for posts made by people on campus. A short video, one of Mysterion facing off against the Coon. They seemed to be talking, the stout power trying to argue, and Mysterion speaking in tones inaudible. That was over by the football field, where he'd had lunch with Kenny about every day this week. Kyle made a dumb decision. They hadn't blocked off the roads yet. Kyle parked his car and began filming the second he stepped out of his car. He wasn't missing this. The thrill of being back in the midst of everything was back. Promise of heroes and action and things no one really understood. Kyle had been good at this. Good enough he was sought out by Mysterion, the most aloof and attached person to roam the city. Kyle took a breath. Stop. His nerves were skyrocketing. He wished Kenny were there. He hadn't even come across any of the heroes yet, though the way he spoke about them, he seemed to think they were cool. He could use his calming presence at that moment, especially considering he might talk to Mysterion after this. Maybe. He didn't know what he was supposed to be feeling. Everything was too quiet. Why was no one else here? Was it really that frightening or new? Was something else happening in the city for the police not to be on them already? Kyle said nothing, despising the kind of videos that had nobodies blathering on about what they saw, and slipped through the bleachers. "Pulling me out here for?" the Coon was complaining, in a voice that for some reason made Kyle cringe. "I was helping." "You need to leave this place alone," Mysterion was saying, and Kyle realized they were literally just standing on the bleachers. What a lame shot. He wanted them in the middle of the football field, staring each other down, not talking on the bleachers like teenagers. "You're not even supposed to be out in the daytime," the Coon sneered. Kyle could see him cross his arms, steel claws tapping along his arm bracers. "Aren't you, like, nocturnal or something?" "I am always around, somewhere," Mysterion spoke coolly, and yes, even now, Kyle found himself shivering. "You should remember that. Don't assume I'm not watching you." "Well, what's your deal? I'm just taking a detour. I thought I'd hang with the kids. I'm not even doing anything." "This place," Mysterion growled, fists clenched. "This place you leave alone. Don't ever come here again, in or out of costume. I'll know." "Yeah, what are you, my mom?" the Coon replied jeeringly. "You're not the boss of us, you know. You're not even a real hero. You're one of the old guys. No one likes you. You're on your way out. You gotta stay relevant. This isn't a popularity contest!" Mysterion snarled, raising his voice. "I take my job seriously. You leave these kids alone." Kyle didn't understand. What did it matter if some half-assed hero walked around with college kids? Admittedly, he didn't know much about the Coon, but what he was proving here, a pompous, self-centered ass in it for the publicity, this was hardly warranting a campus shutdown. He was just a fucking idiot. Kyle leaned against one of the supports in the bleachers, debating turning off the recording. He glanced down at the phone, listening to Mysterion quarrel. He still felt the sting of embarrassment and rejection. Kenny might claim that Kyle was cool, And yes, it might have been mostly on Mysterion for the bad parting, but he still felt like an idiot. Or what? The coon taunted. Kyle looked up to see he didn't even look worried. He was staring down the city's most feared villain. That's why they shut down the campus. Mysterion. Don't even try to goad me. Mysterion spoke coolly. You're not worth the blood I'd get on my uniform. Yeah, wouldn't want the goodwill get-up damaged. The hero spoke flatly. I'm not leaving. You're the one they're scared of. You leave. Get off campus, Mysterion said, and Kyle had had just about enough. He shoved his phone in his pocket, walking back to the aisle. Make me, the coon replied, and Kyle hopped onto the bleachers, leaning against the railing, pissed. Both heroes paused and stared. Oddly enough, both with equal parts amazement, as if Kyle were the last person they expected to see. Kyle! Mysterion sounded as close to horrified as he ever had, but the coon just about burst into sunshine. Kyle? He said in incredulous delight, and the redhead froze. How he hadn't recognized his old frenemy, he wasn't sure. Cartman had been one of his first friends, until the harassment came to blows. Cartman? Kyle was in disbelief. There was no way that fat ass somehow actually became one of the city's heroes. What the fuck do you think you're doing? What the fuck are you doing? Wait! Cartman pointed between Kyle and Mysterion with one pointed claw. Are you two... Is this why you want me to leave? He asked Mysterion, sounding like his birthday had come early. Kyle! You fucking the city's grungy boy? Now he knew for a fact Cartman didn't read newspapers. I'm a reporter. Kyle wanted to get back on track. How are you? Kyle, go home! Mysterion ordered him at the same time Cartman smoked. That doesn't answer my question. I'm not going anywhere. Kyle snapped at the vigilante, and the coon raised his hands. That's what I told him, he confided to Kyle. This really your type? Got the hot for dark and mysterious, Jew boy? Don't refer to him like that. Mysterion was again spoken over, this time by Kyle. Just fucking answer my question before I kick your ass back to the mountains. Kyle took steps up the bleachers as he spoke, face red hot. What the fuck do you think you're doing? I'm saving the city. What about you, Kyle? Cartman crossed his arms, looking like a child on the playground. Didn't see you in uniform risking your life for the city. I don't see you risking your life for the city either. Kyle pointed out with a sneer. Mysterion took a threatening step towards Kyle. I told you to leave, he said menacingly. Kyle was unimpressed. I thought we weren't friends, he snapped, stepping towards him as well, without fear. Cartman actually looked somewhat impressed. Why don't you fuck off already? Mysterion actually flinched, and the other hero slapped his forehead. My bad, guys. I got it backwards, he said, carefully avoiding his own claws. That's a strange one, Misty. What's Kyle got for you? Kyle was red, but held Mysterion's gaze. The vigilante dropped his, infuriating him. Not interested, he said coldly, reveling in the flush of power. Not friends, were they? Next time, don't make fun of someone and kiss them before leaving forever. Now both of you get out of here. You put us on lockdown for this shit. He whirled most of his accusations at Mysterion, who was staring out the balcony over the field. If I can't retake my test, I'm going to kill both of you myself. I see you haven't changed. Cartman scoffed. You still sucking principals' dicks for grades or what? Shut up, Cartman, Mysterion said in such a low voice that Kyle froze. Oh, they were bordering on trouble now. You! Kyle got into Mysterion's space, and the vigilante seemed to stiffen. Are making things worse. Get out of here so they can lift the band. Mysterion seemed frozen. I can handle this, Kyle, the coon said regally. I am a hero, you know. No, you aren't, and I'm reporting you as soon as I get this asshole out of here, Kyle said without looking. Maybe they'll charge you with extreme dickery and fuckassery. What? Cartman squawked, and Kyle gritted his teeth, years of irritation and anger screeching at him to just deck the guy. You are playing with things you don't fucking understand, Kyle said, voice low and smooth, and promised a swift death. He was inches from wringing his fat fucking neck. You are not a hero. You're an incompetent fat loser trying to cash out on suffering for your own gain, just like you always have. Cartman looked at him for a second, and then he swung. Kyle was on a lower step than he was, easily ducking out of reach, but Mysterion's final string of patience snapped. With an inhuman snarl, he grabbed the coon by the collar, throwing him back against the middle bleachers. It was a stupid move, earning him some new gashes on his upper arm, but he didn't seem to notice. You will not touch Kyle! Something was wrong with his voice. Kyle shoved his way between them. What makes you think I need your help? He snapped at Mysterion. I'll kick his ass myself, fuck off! Cartman was wiping his face, bleeding and pissed. He wasn't even a threat here, unable to touch someone like Kyle, who was quick on his feet and on essentially tall stairs. He'd be exhausted in minutes. Look, I'm sorry, Mysterion was saying, quickly and quietly. For what I did and send to you. That wasn't fair to you, it's my fault. Something prickled in the back of his mind. What? Kyle said at the same moment Cartman wobbled up. I'll kill you for that! He hissed, and Mysterion whirled. Kyle caught his arm. The vigilante could have shrugged him off, but stopped anyhow, staring at the redhead as he spoke. Don't, Kyle said icily. If you're sorry, don't. He hadn't been this close to the man in ages. He saw Mysterion clench his jaw before answering. That's not fair, he murmured, and Kyle tightened his grip. Are you sorry? He asked as Cartman steadied himself. Mysterion couldn't afford to make himself look less in the eyes of the public. He was already being hunted. He could see him swallow. Back off, Kyle told him, and Mysterion finally looked at him again. Kyle stared. There was something wrong, off, about his face. His mind couldn't connect it to Mysterion, even though it clearly was Mysterion. As Kyle's attention drifted, sharp, pristine claws sliced through Mysterion's face as easily as if it were softened butter. The vigilante screamed in rage, blood pouring from his face. Cartman looked as startled and horrified as Kyle was, freezing in place and leaving him open. Kyle let go of Mysterion briefly, caught him off balance with a kick. He stumbled back, Kyle flying the last 3 steps to match him. Cartman was larger than Kyle, but Kyle was fast, and once Cartman was actually down, he whirled to look at Mysterion. His face was peeling. He clutched at it, blood pouring. The knives sliced through the cartilage of his nose. Kyle stumbled back to crouch next to him. Go, get out of here, Mysterion was saying, voice stretched with pain. I'll heal. Please, Kyle, leave. Holy shit, Kyle whispered, probably the least helpful thing he could say at that moment. He felt sick. I'm not leaving you. Mysterion was already leaning on him at that point, body twitching. If I die, I'll come back, he panted, shuddering against Kyle. It's my secret. I live. Always live. Go, Kyle, please, don't get hurt. Kyle wasn't sure how much of that was truth. And anyhow, Mysterion was practically in his arms at this point, bleeding all over his clothes. You promise you heal, you regenerate, he said, and Mysterion groaned as he nodded in assent. Can you move? How long does it take? The vigilante wasn't answering. Kyle picked his phone from his pocket with shaking hands, trying to decide what to do. Kyle, B, I don't know if you're on lockdown, but I need your help. Right now, football field, where are you? He was supposed to meet Kenny for class. He might have snuck into the science building, but he was innovative. He'd find a way out. He couldn't carry Mysterion down the steps, and there had to be people on their way right now. Kenny wasn't answering. Wasn't he wondering where Kyle was? The redhead closed his eyes, trying to think. Get up, he told Mysterion, just like last time. You can lean on me, but you have to stand. I can't carry you down the bleachers on my own. The man seemed to want to help, bearingly shifting his arm over his shoulder. More or less, Kyle had to lift him up into a standing position, jaw clenched under the effort. Bathroom, east exit, Mysterion was slurring. No cameras. Okay, good. Shorter distance. Only Mysterion couldn't make a step, stumbling and falling until Kyle caught him. Great, so blood loss, excellent. He better get on that regeneration fucking fast as shit. Change of plans, I'm carrying you, Kyle said wearily, having to force a fireman pickup from the side. Mysterion was heavy, the cloak was in his way, wet blood continued to seep into his clothing. Mysterion seemed preoccupied with keeping his eyeballs in his head, not complaining as Kyle carried him down the stairs. He wasn't going to be able to keep this up for long, but the bathroom was close, and Kyle trusted him as they ducked inside, slowly lowering him onto the dirty tile. Mysterion was breathing shallowly, and had pulled the mask entirely over his eyes. It was soaked in blood, and the jagged tears showed almost more than Kyle could stomach. He slowly sank to the ground, legs aching, and went to Kenny's contact again. Boy, if this wasn't going to be a test of the relationship. If they made it through this, he was bringing the boy home to meet his mother. He could handle anything after what he was about to ask right now. Kyle listened to the phone ring, panting against the concrete wall. Why could he hear the phone ringing? Kyle stared at the corner stall. Some abandoned backpack had been sitting there, and he hadn't cared to pay attention to it. Only now that his attention was focused, could he see the silver duct tape around one strap. Slowly, the entire picture began to click together. Kyle abandoned both the bleeding hero and his phone, reaching to drag out the backpack. He could still hear the ringtone. He unzipped the front pocket and pulled out Kenny's phone. He clicked it just to be sure. Karen smiled back at him from the lock screen. The bag held his books and clothes. Kyle slowly zipped the bag back up. He looked over to the vigilante. Everything felt surreal. The gasping breaths echoed in the bathroom. His clothes stuck to him in places where the blood had seeped through Mysterion's mask. The tall, lanky hero. Kyle stood slowly, walking over to stand next to him. Mysterion didn't seem to notice. He stooped beside him, hands shaking. Kyle wasn't afraid. He pulled back the hood, not even getting a reaction. With none of the tenderness he'd previously held, he ripped off the mask. Mysterion cried out at that, the blood having dried just enough to stick in some places. Kyle didn't even bat an eyelash. Blonde hair was stained almost strawberry, with deep gashes disguising the face, but not enough. It told Kyle all he wanted to know, what he needed confirmation on. If the coon being Cartman had been a shock, Kyle didn't have words for this. Kenny must have passed out on the bleachers, because he didn't stir. He couldn't exactly close his eyes at that moment, but he wasn't awake. It was Kenny. Mysterion was Kenny. Kenny was Mysterion. Kyle couldn't process it. It didn't make sense. The two were so polar in who they were. Kenny was nothing like Mysterion, except for the morals, and height, and how fond he ended up being for him. Kyle took a breath. He'd been an idiot. This entire time, Kenny had been playing around with what he felt, listening so attentively to the tales about Mysterion, knowing all along the whole fiasco of him leaving. And for what? To show up later as a civilian and prey on Kyle's broken heart? He stood, feeling dizzy. He caught himself in one of the sinks, staring into the mirror. Kyle slammed his hand into it, not even cracking it. Hand stinging, he whipped around, stepping over the prone figure without looking twice. He was shaking. "You regenerate," he hissed at him, eyes stinging. "So fuck you!" He picked up his phone and didn't turn around. Everything was disconnected. Wrong. So his short-time boyfriend happened to be a manipulative liar. Par for the course in college, really. Kyle walked back to his car, enraged and wearing a sweater destroyed by blood. Kyle missed the rest of his classes that day. He went back to his home, showered and changed, throwing his blood-soaked sweater into the garbage. Everything was done with an autopilot type of mindset, tired and dazed and shocked. He stared down at the sweater, water dripping from his hair, blood, Mysterion's blood, Kenny's blood. He left the bathroom, sinking down into his couch just to lay on his stomach, feeling blank and empty. One of the blankets he'd covered Mysterion with was still on it. The pain of it all was sharp now, and mingled with fear. Why? What was he trying to do? What did he have to gain? Why leave his life entirely just to come back as his alter ego? Which one was the real man? Kenny acted nothing like Mysterion, aside from both being bright and their connection to him. Why that connection? It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. Kyle felt like he was starting to lose his mind. How far back did this go? Had he been a stalker? His phone bleeped cheerfully. He looked over at it. It had been an hour or so since he'd left campus. Regeneration. And some weird shit about resurrection. He should just turn it off. Not answer it. Don't get up. Kyle was already on his way to it. Kenny M. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I wanted to protect you and I fucked up. Let me know you're okay, please. I'm sorry, Kyle. I shouldn't have done this to you. Kyle slammed his phone back down. He leaned against the counter, covering his face. No, he didn't want Kenny to be soft and apologetic. His skin was crawling. Kenny sounded upset from his text alone. He wasn't even using the dumb slang he normally did, and that bothered him. More calls and texts came in the next 20 minutes as Kyle lay on the couch, silently watching with a stony expression. Kenny M. I should have told you this story from the beginning. I'm sorry. Kenny M. Kyle? Kenny M. I didn't want to put you in danger, but I did anyway. Kenny M. I'm coming over. Kyle narrowed his eyes at the last one and texted back, quick and final. Kyle B. Don't. There was an instantaneous response. Kenny M. Then come meet me or pick up the phone. Kyle B. Do not come anywhere near my fucking house. That alarmed him, sending his pulse spiking. Mysterion knew where he lived. Kenny called again, but Kyle picked up this time, ready. Who the fuck even are you? He said, sitting up on the couch. Stay the fuck away from me. Kyle, let me explain. Kenny began, and Kyle threw up his free hand. Explain then! He snapped. There was dead silence on the phone. Go on, fuckshit. What were you trying to do? Yes. Kenny's voice was softer. It occurred to Kyle that he had left him in poor condition. Not that he cared, and he was clearly alive. He cringed, trying to clear his mind. Just listen. I am Mysterion, Kenny whispered, as if it were still a secret. You know what that means. No matter what you think of me, I tangle with the worst of the worst. Kyle said nothing. I shouldn't have gotten you involved in the first place, he said quietly. That was my fault. I liked your input. Things were easier with you. You kept me upright. Your outlook on life was different. You kept Mysterion from becoming what everyone said he was. You kept me on the right path. I felt like I needed you. He paused, but Kyle bit down on his tongue. Don't say a fucking word. Mysterion fell in love with you, Kenny admitted when Kyle didn't speak. Kyle closed his eyes. Honestly, but I was afraid to get you hurt. So why show up again? Kyle finally couldn't keep himself quiet. Why show up as Kenny at my school? I already went to the school, he said awkwardly, but Kyle wasn't done. Does Karen even exist? You didn't really come from South Park, did you? Kyle accused. I did. She does. Everything I told you was true, Kenny promised, a bit frantically. Do you realize what that sounds like now? Kyle threw back at him. I'm not even sure I can sleep here tonight. You'll come break the locks off my home or some shit. Kenny was quiet, but Kyle could hear him breathing. I didn't tell you who I was, Kenny said quietly. But that's as far as me lying went. Everything else is true. I never hurt you, not ever. I know it's hard to trust me now, but... What were you trying to do? Kyle demanded. Why this whole fucking thing? Another pause, with Kenny sounding incredulous. I loved you, he said, and Kyle gritted his teeth. I missed you. It was selfish, but I didn't want you hurt. I wanted to be friends. Kyle wanted to tell him it was stupid. He opened his mouth to do so, and immediately closed his mouth again. He swallowed. What, do you want me to forgive you? Kyle bit, going for less hurt. I'm not asking you to do anything, Kenny said, sounding irritated for the first time. Then what do you want? I don't know, the blonde said, something thunking in the background. I don't know. They were both quiet. Kyle pressed his hand to his forehead. I love you. So, all this, you were... The whole time, Kenny had been behind the mask. Knew Kyle was infatuated with Mysterion, listened to him talk about the hero, and said nothing about the truth behind it. Playing around with what he felt, what he thought, pretended to meet Kyle for the first time, even though he knew so much about him. How fucking dare you? It was creepy. It was deceitful. Kyle didn't even know how to articulate it. All this history he had with Mysterion and Kenny, destroyed forever. He could never really be sure what he was being told was the truth. Kyle's throat restricted. I know. Kenny sounded more like Mysterion now, quiet and unemotional. It pissed him off. I suppose you're okay now, Kyle asked, something in his voice drawling. Kenny paused before offering a careful, yes. Good. If I ever see or hear from you again, you can explain to Karen why you're sitting in a fucking jail cell. And then Kyle hung up. He wasn't going to tell anyone the identity of Mysterion. Not outright. He'd set some things up in case he went missing. After so long defending Mysterion, Kyle felt unnerved to think of being on his bad side. And yet he couldn't bring himself to... In all honesty, he almost believed Kenny. Almost. That Kenny didn't mean harm. Even if this had been totally harmless, was just Kenny, Mysterion's way of acting on love. That didn't make it right. It didn't mean he wasn't mad as hell. He needed to be left alone. Just alone. Just for now, if nothing happened, he'd stay where he was, but... Kyle began packing his bags for a surprise weekend at home. Just in case. Just to get out of town. He'd tell his parents he had the day off on his way there. He threw his sweater out before he left, not even wanting to see if it would be salvageable. He'd never get all that blood out. Kenny didn't text him again. Kyle woke up the next morning and checked his phone. For what, he wasn't exactly certain. Another apology would have just pissed him off. His heart still ached. He checked the news back home again and again. The coon escaped custody for unknown reasons, but was being questioned. Mysterion fled the scene. Kyle was bound to be contracted once they reviewed the tapes. His old editor would be panting to get the story out to the public. Kyle turned off his phone entirely. He sat up, looked around what used to be his room. His parents used it as a guest room now, painted the walls a quiet gray and matched it with bright furniture. Any trace of him living there had been erased. It made him feel just a bit cold. Kyle stepped out of bed and grabbed his jacket. He snuck downstairs, zipping up the jacket and slipping on his shoes. He'd slip his phone into his back pocket, even though it stayed off. The last thing he needed was Ike peeking through his personal life for some good blackmail material while he was outside. He needed a walk, and he kind of had an idea where he wanted to go. Thankfully, no one was up yet to question where Kyle was going before the sun. The college boy managed to get outside without incident and started walking down the sidewalk. Everyone he hung out with no longer lived there. They all moved to different parts of the state, the country. Their houses behind him were not what he was looking for. What he was looking for was ahead, surrounded by a chain-link fence with garbage everywhere. Kyle took a glance behind him before hopping over the fence, jumping to clear most of the dangerous debris, and shoving his hands into his pockets as he walked. It almost felt like grief, like he was grieving the loss of Kenny. He'd gained a friend, a boyfriend, someone he genuinely liked, and so quickly and easily fell into his life and made it better. Kenny was sweet. He liked listening. He craved attention and affection and liked anything to do with people, and loved having classes with Kyle. He was flirtatious, cheerful, considerate. He cared about his sister more than anything, worked to support her and him both, which Kyle admired greatly. And had things been different, Kyle would have found himself admiring the choice to be a vigilante. Skirting past the piles of piled up garbage, he probably should have changed before starting his exploration. Something better than baggy clothes. Regardless, he still managed to come across the shack. It was not nearly big enough for 4 people, much less 5, as Kenny had told Kyle he had an older brother who was going to school in California. He didn't dare go inside. The place might fall down around his ears. Kyle leaned against an old car as he looked at it, not minding the dirt being ground into his clothing. He couldn't imagine being born here, just down the street, being the lowest tier and made fun of. Kenny made sure no one messed with Karen. Kyle wasn't surprised. He'd been in awe of Mysterion. He admired Kenny. He could see what a fascinating story he had, coming from nothing and becoming a hero for his sister, a hero for the city. If he just sat him down and explained, none of this weird lying, deceiving, told him right off the bat who he was. If Mysterion had always been Kenny. That thought blew his mind. All this time, everything that had happened had been Kenny behind the mask. The vigilante broke bones, fought crime bosses, had been caught on fire and kept coming for a man like a demon out of hell, had been a silly boy who whistled at Kyle when he did something dumb, like drop his pencil in class, who loved sweet drinks and giving Kyle sweet kisses, the carefree, loving kid who blushed if his flirtations were returned, or if Kyle so much as kissed him unexpectedly. The entire time, Mysterion had loved him, had viewed Kyle as someone to guide him, which explains why he came by so often, to get another outlook, to run a plan by him and see if he was taking a good standpoint. He trusted him, grew to care about him, left because he didn't want Kyle in danger, and that fucking moron just waltzed back in, as if Kenny had no ties to any of it. Mysterion loved him. Kenny loved him. Kyle covered his face. He'd poured out his heart to Kenny about what happened with Mysterion. His reaction made sense now. He'd been awkward himself, in love and afraid, kissing Kyle just once before leaving forever. Oh god, he'd gushed to Kenny so many times and tried to convince the guy that Mysterion was one of the city's good guys. He went on and on about him, like a schoolboy crush, and Kenny had to listen to his idiot self basically drool over him. Somehow, that made it even more embarrassing than gushing to his boyfriend about another guy. The whole time, he'd loved him. God damn it, Kenneth, Kyle muttered, and he thought he was emotionally challenged. What a fucking moron. Kenny wasn't going to hurt him. Whatever was going on, Kenny wasn't going to hurt him. More honestly, he'd left to keep him from showing up. He didn't really feel too much like forgiveness right now. Not with it being so weird, raw. Still, Kyle reached into his pocket for his phone. He clicked it on, immediately being bombarded. Fucking shit. Calls, text messages from tons of people, mostly from his old boss. Kenny was radio silent, and a series of messages from a number he didn't receive came. You made a big mistake. It's really easy to find out where you live, you know. Too bad you're not home. You crossed the wrong person, and you're going to be sorry. If you tell anyone, you're going to be in trouble. Understand? I'll find you. Answer me, you fucking... Kyle rolled his eyes at the last 2 words. At least the insults were specific enough. He knew who sent it. Few people outside of South Park knew Kyle's religion. He was being threatened. And Cartman, of course, knew where Kyle's family lived. Not that the guy had ever been any kind of challenge. He was still just a powered-up fuckboy with ties to his family. Kyle licked his lips. I could probably take him if it came to that. The kid was just as rough and tumble as his older brother, but... He picked up his phone again, pressing the second number on his recent calls. Kyle did not expect Kenny to pick up, but it barely rang once before it was answered. "What do you want?" Kenny asked, quiet and angry. Kyle chewed on the inside of his cheek before deciding to just be blunt. "I've been threatened," Kyle said calmly. As he expected, Kenny immediately began speaking. "Who? When? Cartman?" Kenny's questions came out fast. "What happened?" "It was definitely Cartman," Kyle said wryly, "and apparently he's been by my house." "What?" Kyle could hear a shuffling on the other end of the line, and a girl's voice asking Kenny what was wrong. Kyle's heart froze. It was like ice being thrown over him, proving that yes, he definitely still cared. I mean, he broke up with him. Kind of? He didn't just move on somewhere, did he? Okay, maybe it was selfish, but Kyle definitely loved Kenny, and he wasn't okay with this. God, he didn't think he was a jealous type, but holy shit, this was strong. "Hello, Kyle?" Kenny was saying, alarmed. "Are you still there?" What? Kyle mentally shook himself. "I didn't hear you. I'm back at South Park. Cell phone reception." Hopefully, Kenny didn't realize that was bullshit. "Oh." Kenny sounded relieved. "You weren't home. Good." "Dude, I'm not scared of Cartman," Kyle said, alarmed. "I just don't want him messing with my family." "Kyle, considering who I am," Kenny said softly, all bitterness out of his voice, "would you have thought I'm capable of what I am?" Kyle recalled a million little moments. Fire, rage, Mysterion snapping a bone with his bare hands. "But this is Cartman," Kyle protested weakly. It didn't compute. "I can handle Cartman." "Kai." Concern and affection were so laced in the stupid nickname that Kyle cut himself off. He hated nicknames, but somehow Kenny had always just made the exception. "He's got connections, and when he's behind the mask, he can do whatever he wants. He plays hero all day long. He's not the brightest, and he knows how to be charismatic on the surface to people who follow him. He's having fun. If he thinks you're going to play whistleblower and stop all this, you're in danger. From him or his friends." Kyle exhaled slowly. "You think he'll come after me himself, or call a hit on me?" "He's already been at your house, you said," Kenny pointed out. "Kyle, he's already put a mark on your back." Kyle said nothing, so he might not be working with just Cartman anymore. "Kai," Kenny said again, focusing his attention. "What do you want to do?" He closed his eyes, breathed, think it through. "I almost thought about visiting someone else," he said, mulling it over. "But if I step away, Cartman is going to come after Ike if he's smart. I'd come running back and he'd have a gambling piece." "You're probably right," Kenny was saying, and Kyle recognized the tone he took when he was thinking. Mysterion. His love of people, studying psychology and criminology. This was all who Mysterion was. "And if you stay there, they'll be in the line of fire." "So I have to come home," Kyle said quietly. "You might not have much of a choice, Kyle," Kenny said softly. Both remained quiet. "Look," Kenny said, "I'm sorry. I put you in this situation." Kyle took another breath, straightening. "I ran my own damn mouth to him. Don't take all the credit." Kyle heard Kenny's surprised noise of protest and smiled lazily. "I take responsibility for this one. I can't just go back home. I need to talk to him." "No!" Kenny immediately protested, but Kyle interrupted him. "I need you there," he said calmly. "I'm going to reveal the coon's identity in a newspaper piece before I even leave South Park. My editor is waiting. I need to take him out of the game." "Kyle, I'm almost certain he has connections to the police," Kenny warned quietly. "Just from what I've heard from him. He might wiggle out of anything you try to place on him." Kyle began to pace, brows scrunching. "What if I blackmailed him?" "I think something would happen to you." Kenny's voice was strained. "And he has worse blackmail than you, Kai. He knows where Ike lives." This is true. Kyle kept walking, tripping over pieces of a rusted car. He needed leverage. There's nothing he cares about more than himself, Kyle said wearily. I have nothing else on him but his identity. He's not scared of me anymore. Kenny's voice sounded just as tired. I can't threaten him away. I failed last time. Why did you even do that? Kyle demanded to know, leaning back against the car, shoving curls off his forehead. I just wanted him to stay away from you. Kenny sounded embarrassed. Kyle flushed. He's not a good character. I had no idea you two knew each other. He was tempted to bite back with a good job of some sort, but decided against it. He tried to think of something slightly kinder to say. In the background, he could hear other people talking to Kenny. Probably, the boy said in reply, and Kyle finally broke. Kenny, he asked, flushing. Who is that? I spent the night at Karen's, Kenny replied, still sounding distracted. I'll probably be leaving soon. If he's threatening people, I don't want to chance it. Your sister, Karen? Kyle asked before he thought better of it. Oh God, that was so stupid. Kyle covered his eyes with his free hand, face burning. A heavy, confident flirt broke Kenny's surprised silence. Yes, my sister. Don't worry, baby, I'm not messing around any. Fucking shit. There was too much in that sentence to be properly processed. The fucking awful pet name of baby, no one else dared to call him. The dripping voice, the promise that insinuated he still considered himself his boyfriend, Good, he said stupidly, hearing Kenny giggle on the other end of the phone. I'll... Shitting fuck. He was turning into a moron. He didn't get tongue-tied like this. Kenny's giggles were getting worse. Someone shut him the fuck up, please. Kyle cleared his throat. I think I need to get back to the city, he said awkwardly. I just definitely need to put some distance between my family and the situation. I'll meet you. Kenny's voice was back to firm reassurance. We'll figure out what to do. Kyle closed his eyes and made a decision. Thanks, Ken, he said quietly. They'd figure all this out later as well. Right now, he needed to keep his family and himself out of danger. Of course, Kai, the boy said. And do me a favor. What's that? Kyle asked, beginning to walk back home. Be very, very careful, Kenny said simply. You be careful too, Kyle said, pausing to lean against a fence. Kenny must have heard the clink and paused. Kyle didn't particularly want to tell him what he went to go look at. Where are you? He asked, and Kyle's lips curved into a smirk, a perfect roundabout. Don't worry, sweetheart, Kyle threw back at him, earning what sounded like a squeak from the guy. I'm not messing around. Kenny wasn't saying anything, and Kyle grinned, heart feeling lighter than it had in ages. I'll call you on the way back home. Okay, the boy said, sounding pleased but embarrassed with himself, so he could render the ferocious Mysterion speechless and shy. He smiled, awkwardly scratching his cheek. I'll see you soon, Kyle promised. Kenny's voice was all warmth. I'll be here, he replied, and Kyle hung up the phone. Okay. Kyle was being hunted by the false hero boy of the city. His family was in danger. His superhero liar of a friend / boyfriend was still into him. He had to get out of here. He'll use his editor as an excuse. He had to get back to work. He'd tell his family goodbye and tell Cartman he was still hanging around the city. Make Cartman go crazy looking in all his usual spots. And then he and Kenny would make a plan. He'd call it more of a truce than forgiveness, but the heavy blanket of stress and anger had at least eased off his shoulders. Time to get back to the quick life of heroes and villainy. Kyle jogged back to his house and flew in the back door, covered in dirt and face pink with more than exertion or the weather. Kyle parked his car at the college, back behind one of the dorms. He had no reason to be back there, and hopefully no one would be watching. He had no idea if Cartman was lurking around, or who he knew, and whether they were watching, or what he was planning, or how quickly the plan would go into action. That's why he was meeting Kenny. Kyle pulled his knit hat down over his curls, locking the car and walking away from the parking lot and to the sidewalk. He'd more or less stolen the hat from his brother, wanting not to be seen from across the fucking city. The con of being a natural redhead continued to plague his life. Kenny was sitting up on one of the statue bases in front of the dorms, swinging his legs over the cobblestone path as he looked down at his phone. Yeah, you wouldn't think this boy was Mysterion. Kyle took a moment to observe him. Ratty jeans, a sweatshirt frayed at the end, beat-up sneakers, skinny, cheery, a total goofball. It collided so much with who Mysterion was. So was it an act? A front? In the end, he was right back to the first question he asked after they met. Who was Mysterion? Kyle walked up to him, resting his arms on the statue base. The boy looked up in surprise, the expression melting into concerned warmth that surprised Kyle. He turned to face him, pulling his legs up like a 6-year-old at recess. Hey, how you doing? Kenny asked, all concern. He hasn't been here. We probably should leave campus, though. He knows that you go to school here. Yeah. Kyle didn't have much more to say than that. He dropped his hands to his arms, feeling irritated. Cold concrete seeped through his hoodie, chilling him. He's still gotta ruin my goddamn life somehow, doesn't he? On the school grounds, they had been evenly matched. Maybe even skewed in Kyle's favor. There he knew what limits the other had, and what he could get away with, what he was capable of. Here, everything was taken away from Kyle, and it pissed him off. He is good at that shit, Kenny said thoughtfully, pulling Kyle's hat down to cover the curls escaping the bottom of it. Hey, look at me. Kyle lifted his head tiredly, chin resting against his arms. I've got all my stuff, Kenny said, tugging one of the straps of his backpack, just in case. Besides, you kicked his ass last time. He was smiling, blue eyes crinkling. We'll figure it out, man. Kyle watched him quietly. There was no hint of anger or any kind of residual grudge from their abrupt departure. It made him feel weird. The whole situation was weird. Kenny was Kenny, except he also wasn't. He was Mysterion, and Kyle knew them both, only he didn't. He didn't trust Kenny, except he did way more than anyone else. He'd have his back, and yet Kyle was worried. Just weird. Regardless, Kyle lifted his hand to touch his face, startling Kenny to the point he was perfectly still, watching. I shouldn't have left you, Kyle said, fortifying himself and just owning up to the dumb thing. He was definitely in the right to be pissed. Just leaving his boyfriend lying, bleeding, on the bathroom floor, even if he did regenerate, was an iffy life choice. He soothed his thumb over his cheek. You couldn't even tell the skin had been damaged. Yeah, well, I guess I know why you would. Kenny seemed to want to brush him aside, and Kyle's other hand came up to cup his face. That seemed to quiet him, and the boy watched, unsure. This thin-faced, skinny guy was Mysterion, the brutalizing enemy of criminals everywhere. Someone who had come to Kyle for ages, for something like guidance. He let Kyle pick him up off the ground, boss him around, patch him up, and all this time Kyle took his hands away, almost nervously. Kenny looked bewildered, tilting his head like a confused golden retriever puppy. When Kyle said nothing and instead averted his gaze, embarrassed, Kenny broke the heavy silence. "Want to get some food?" he asked gently. Backed by the sun, Kenny could have honestly been anyone but Mysterion. Bright, vibrant, forgiving, considerate. Kyle took a breath, eyeing the boy. Sure. They picked a cafe not far from campus. Kyle was more aware than ever of where he was and what he was doing. He obsessively tugged at his hat until Kenny began to smack his hands away. "You're doing fine, Kyle," he said, rolling his eyes. "You're drawing more attention to yourself by fussing." Kyle said nothing, scowling down at his sandwich. He didn't like to feel powerless. He wanted the problems right in front of him, overcome, even if you had to beat back that shit with your bare hands. The uncertainty was what got him. He wasn't used to feeling like this. "So, what are we going to do?" Kyle asked, not feeling much like eating. That could have serious repercussions for him, but he honestly didn't think he could right now. Kenny's sunny demeanor flipped, like it did in class when they were presented with something he genuinely needed to think over. That look was so recognizable now. Mysterion's expression of thoughtfulness as Kyle puzzled out the situation or challenged a plan. It was bizarre. "I know you know who he is," Kenny said slowly, "but you know Cartman, not the coon. There's some things you need to know." Kyle listened attentively, brows furrowing. "Cartman will absolutely attempt violence." Kenny ticked off a finger. "And he dared to actually strike me down last time. He'll have no qualms taking you down, especially now that you've pissed him off." Kyle nodded slightly. "He looked shocked that I did," he recalled, stabbing his ice with a straw. "I was able to catch him off guard." "Yeah, but that wasn't due to any type of remorse," Kenny scoffed. "He was scared of retaliation, trust me." Kyle picked a chip off his plate to nibble, thinking, "What else?" Again, he keeps getting out of trouble with the cops, and I don't know why." Kenny went back to his mental list. Or how. "He's probably made the least impact on the city," Kyle pointed out. "Really, the guy has done nothing but cause minor inconveniences and staged publicity." "Meaning what?" Kenny asked, attention focused. Kyle couldn't quite look away from his eyes again. How had he never noticed? "If you want to catch a rat, ask a mouse." Kyle recounted something he'd read ages ago. "He's inconsequential at the end of the day. He could give immunity for giving heroes names, for example. He doesn't know who you are, does he?" "No," Kenny replied immediately. His lips twitched slightly. "I mean, he knows who I am. He was at the same school as I was. But he doesn't know who Mysterion is. I haven't seen him face to face since I moved out." Kyle felt himself relax. "So, you're safe," he murmured, and Kenny tried to hide his smile. "Supposedly," he said, smiling openly when Kyle looked up. "Depends. How angry are you at me?" "Ass." Kyle narrowed his eyes at him slightly. "Is that really a good thing to be asking me right now?" Kenny's expression melted away, and Kyle realized he hadn't taken that how he'd ought to. "I mean," Kyle leaned his elbow on the table as he spoke, "you should have told me. It makes things weird now. But I'm not going to be angry at you over it. I left you on the fucking ground bleeding. You should be pissed as hell." "Oh, I was," Kenny assured him. "But yeah, you kind of found out I was sort of lying to you the whole time. It had to be a shock." "Thought maybe I should be afraid," Kyle admitted, tugging his hat over his ears. "I freaked out. I thought maybe you'd break into my house or something and hurt me." "You did?" Kenny looked alarmed. "The fuck, Kyle? I'd never do that." "Look, I have no idea who you are," Kyle hissed, face red. "In the end, I don't know you. I knew Mysterion a little. I started to know Kenny. Then it's revealed they're one and the same. Two people I never reconciled in my brain. So in the end, I never knew anyone." Kenny puzzled over this a moment, clasping his hands together with his elbows on the table. He could see bits of Mysterion here now, and it still felt a bit like grieving, because really, he'd lost them both in a way, and now they'd have to start over. "I didn't know that would be a thing," Kenny admitted finally. "I didn't really think this through." "Yeah," Kyle couldn't help but jab. "That's a little obvious, Ken." Kenny colored and threw it back at him. "And what else was a thing? I knew you liked me, but I had no idea Kyle Broflovsky was a Mysterion fanboy." Kyle choked. "Oh, Lord. Are you kidding me? You're bringing this up now?" "God, you were so embarrassing to listen to." Kenny covered his face, giggling. No, I left an impact on you. Not that strong. It's so humbling, Kai, honestly. You've been my biggest offender, and to hear you take my side was the most... Stop! Kyle was red now as well, covering his eyes. Both of them looked ridiculous. He didn't need the reminder. He'd been smitten, and it was awful, and he'd like that to die. I liked it, Kenny confessed. Something like babbling. After all the shit I put you through, you still believed I was a good person, and fuck, I didn't deserve that grace, Kyle. His hands suddenly fell. Oh shit, I never said sorry. Kyle, I really did mean it. Stop, Kyle told him, waving his hand in a cut-off gesture. That part we can just let die. I'm definitely done with it. No, look. Kenny dragged his hands through his hair. I don't want you worrying about it anymore. I was in love with you, and I got scared. I backed out. I left you bleeding out on the ground, Kenneth McCormick. Kyle tried to interrupt, and that was a bitch thing to do, but I'm still sorry, Kenny insisted. Look, I started this mess. I needed you. That, Kyle said, bristling. Don't you dare be sorry for that. I worried about you for ages after you left. I checked the news just to make sure you were alive. You told me you didn't have anyone else, and I never forgot that. Kenny's expression was warm. He tilted his head, watching Kyle closely. You're not angry over that? It was humiliating, actually. I was never angry, Kyle admitted, face turning darker. And I was getting over that, thank you very much. Kyle tugged his sweater over his lips, like the day Kyle had asked him out. Something the redhead had begun to associate with discomfort of some kind. Then he had merely been overwhelmed. He doubted that was the case here. He took a breath. Tensions were high, but that was no reason to make Kenny's life a little worse. He needed time to sort this all out properly. Look, it's going to take more than a day to get used to, Kyle said awkwardly. We can have this conversation again. Sometime when things aren't so tense. We're literally being threatened now by someone who breaks the law and may have ties to the local police department. Kenny didn't look overly thrilled, but he nodded. He understood. This wasn't a great time to talk. Not when everything else was going on, and yet Kenny wasn't overly angry at him for the abandonment. Kyle wasn't angry over the deceit. It hadn't been but a fucked up day. Was it stupid or was it mature? Kyle wasn't sure. He liked to think it was indicative that they cared a little bit more about one another than he first thought, enough to work out problems rather than point fingers. Of course, he was always a closet romantic in that sense, so maybe his judgment was a bit flawed, but he'd like to think it was. In the end, Kyle knew Kenny wasn't trying to hurt him. He was just a fucking dumbass. You need to eat something, Kenny pointed out quietly. Kyle glanced up, and Kenny stepped from the table in front of his plate. Come on, man, you get sick easily, the boy said with a lift of his shoulder. I'll go over everything. I know I was an ass. You eat, listen, we'll make up a plan, okay? Kyle bit the inside of his cheek. He reached for Kenny's hand, the other delighted and gleefully offering his own. So the shorter student brought his hand up and kissed it, Kenny freezing to look absolutely uncertain as to what to do next. Kenny loved him. He already said that and wasn't going to again. Kyle was good with that. They didn't have the luxury of being able to explain all their actions or express all their feelings. That would come. Kyle was certain of it. Still, he didn't want to leave things too open-ended. I can see how you're the same person, Kyle admitted, steadying himself. Just to be quick and concise. I want to get to know you again, now that I know. He squeezed his hand. I still care about you, alright? One thing at a time. Let's figure out how we're going to kick his ass. Kenny took a slow, audible breath, making Kyle grin, twining their fingers in Kyle's solid grip. Something deadly strong and very glad. I've got years' worth of information, Kenny said, voice laced with far too much warmth for the topic. Then start talking. Kyle poked at him, smiling. Kenny moved a chair closer, under pretense of secrecy, and then went back through everything he learned from years of close-up fighting with other heroes and villains. This was not a place Kyle would willingly go on his own. Largely abandoned, the big watch factory held a lot of land that still no one knew what to do with. It had been for sale for probably a decade. It was a wonder the city hadn't burned it down already for being a hazard. Kenny said it was the old headquarters of an ex-villain he befriended during his earliest years as Mysterion. The guy had been his first enemy. I doubt you'll end up befriending this one, Kyle murmured, leaning against the cargo door to one of the warehouses. I tried that already, Mysterion said grimly, standing behind Kyle a few paces in the shadows, watching. That didn't work out well. Funny, even his way of speaking changed as Mysterion, not just the voice. It was like a different persona, and again, Kyle wasn't surprised he never figured it out. That was a well-kept secret. What about the guy you did befriend? Kyle asked, checking his phone. Did you have any allies? I convinced him to back out of the game, Mysterion said quietly. He was far too good for this. He's doing better. He's off in another state going to school. Kyle glanced over at the kid. Mysterion was leaning, arms crossed, looking at one of the other buildings at the property. Honestly, are you still refuting being a hero? Kyle's voice was gentle, watching the cloaked figure's attention. Kyle hissed his tongue at him. That's not something normal of any power. Why did you help him? Mysterion was quiet, taking the question into consideration. You're making me sound nicer than I am again, he finally said, tilting his head. The half of his face that Kyle could see looked fond, a softer sort of curve to his lips instead of a scowl. I knew who he was, an old friend of mine. That doesn't make what you did any less admirable, Kyle defended with a slight shake of his head. You're a mess, Mysterion. The boy huffed slightly in amusement. A genuine smile curved his lips. The voice that spoke was very much Kenny. Good thing I got you to sort me out, huh? Kyle hid his own smile by looking away. This was better. It was almost comfortable. It was like they were being placed on even ground again, and it was relieving. Kyle had a plan. Mysterion was his muscle, and together they usually came out of it all right. Kyle decided, much against Kenny's desire, to out the coon. However, they couldn't exactly do this on a whim. Kyle wanted to know exactly where the coon was, and not to have to worry about being jumped on a random corner. He had the story typed up, ready to send to his editor, with directions to also contact the police. Kyle would cover the story and film the proceedings. Mysterion would make sure everything was evenly matched. Between them both, Cartman wouldn't catch them off guard this time. They'd win, he'd be arrested. After years of dealing with his bullshit, Kyle was downright gleeful. He's at the gate, Mysterion pointed out. Kyle looked to see him clambering over the dumpsters, trying to figure out how to scale the tall chain fence around the faculty. Should I send it now? Kyle murmured, and Mysterion made a noise of dissent. I'd rather you not send it at all, the man grumbled. But wait a minute, see if he has anything crazy up his sleeve first. The coon strolled over to them after finally figuring his way over. He didn't look scared, just annoyed. Kyle straightened, squaring his shoulders, and Cartman gave him an earful the second he was in range. The fuck is your problem, Kyle? He snarled, kicking aside a soda can like a child with a temper. This is all I got. You're trying to run me out of town for doing nothing? This was a different mindset than last time. Kyle expected threats, not a plead for sympathy, which wasn't about to work on someone who actually grew up with him. You attacked my friends and made a threat against my life, Kyle said coolly. Doesn't sound like nothing to me, fat ass. You don't know what I have to go home to every night. Cartman pressed a clawed hand against his heart. eyes glimmering. "Don't you have any compassion, Kyle?" "Kyle." Mysterion stepped out of the darkness and made Cartman jump in place. "Holy shit, you creepy asshole!" Cartman pointed at him. "Weren't man enough to face me on your own, Jew boy?" Kenny was twitching with irritation. Kyle found that somewhat satisfying and smirked. "Look, I don't know if you're trying to goad me or appeal me with your sympathy or what," the redhead said, sneering coldly. "But we're goddamn adults now, Eric. You can't keep this up. I'm tired of it." "We were friends, Kyle." Cartman seemed to go back for sympathy or second-guessing. "Don't you have any sympathy for an old friend?" "I'm done with you, honestly," Kyle said, not even bothering to answer. "After all this shit, you're not getting out of this. I've made a letter to my editor." The boy spoke evenly, savoring the moment. "And you're going to be arrested for vigilantism." "Ha!" Cartman said, smugly jabbing a claw in Kyle's direction. Behind him, Mysterion growled. "Don't know if you noticed, but I'm kind of not in prison right now. Thought you were supposed to be smart." Kyle gave Mysterion a look when the other stepped forward to stand next to Kyle. He didn't appreciate the name-calling. Mysterion's eyes were hungry. He looked ready to tear Cartman to pieces. He was about to let him. "Doesn't matter." Kyle managed to keep his cool, opening his phone back up without looking at it. "In 3 minutes, it will be posted to my newspaper's website, with approval from the editor. Do you think the city's gonna give a shit what the police say once they know the truth?" Cartman's expression turned ugly. He gave Mysterion a sideways look, shrugging his shoulders. "Okay," he said, beady eyes watching. "Go ahead." Kyle stupidly paused. That was all the time needed. Kyle wasn't worried about Cartman attacking. He was slower than Kyle, and still a good ways away. Turned out that was for a reason. Mysterion realized what was happening a split second before Kyle, and stepped in front of him. All Kyle saw was light. He had to shield his eyes as the blue-white shock burned into his eyelids, flashing even though his eyes were closed. There was a deafening crack and coldness. Mysterion stumbled back into him. He caught the swearing vigilante in his arms. Mysterion was twitching oddly, grasping his right arm, swearing up an absolute blue streak. Kyle looked up and immediately caught sight of the perpetrator. He recognized Wonderstrike. The shorter, louder part of the strike duo stood with his teeth gritted, hand outstretched and shaking. "Hold the fuck up." "What the fuck?" Kyle shouted at him, the first words he'd ever spoken to the guy in his life. "Are you fucking serious?" Wonder made no reply. Ice particles clung to his hair and clothing. He was oddly silent. "What, think you're the only one who can bring friends?" Cartman goaded as Mysterion pushed himself back up, shaking out his hand with a wince. "You're working for the coon?" Mysterion snapped at Wonder, pissed. "You're not part of his gang." "Nah, Supers is," Cartman mentioned. "Isn't he, Wonder? Came to me after your little breakup. Wonder's got some stuff he'd rather his ex not know. Don't you, kid?" The hero twitched. "That's not why I'm here," he said, voice sharped. "Alright, maybe I can make Super's life a little briefer, but that's not important right now." Cartman looked happy, holding everyone at arm's length and moving them around like pawns. That's what he liked best, holding power over others. Kid in a candy store. "I want to talk to Kyle, Wonder. Why don't you go take his phone away so he can actually chat?" "Wonderstrike," Mysterion warned darkly. "Don't you Kyle and Mysterion jumped in different directions to avoid the blast of ice, spears striking the ground and freezing in a beautiful, symmetrical pattern. Kyle did not stay still. Wonder was blocking his best way out. All he could do now was submit the evidence and back away to wait. But Cartman was coming for him. The law student was forced to retreat, lengthening his distance from the guy. He was quicker, but to Cartman's credit, he kept up with him, trying to trap Kyle in a corner. Mysterion was being no more successful. His talents were for up close, and Wonder was more fighter for range. He didn't seem bent on hurting Mysterion, as much as he seemed to want him to stop. Twice he tried to trap him in ice to immobilize him, but Kenny would not stay still. You think you're helping the right side here, Kyle? Cartman sneered, frustrated when Kyle wouldn't let him get close enough to strike. He's done some weird shit. Do you really think you can bully me and stand for years and expect me to take your side over it all? Kyle snapped, feeling more annoyed than actually worried. No fucking way. You hurt my friend, you threatened my life, and now you're trying to kill me. Excuse me if I don't run to your defense. Hey, somebody here still talks to Stan, and guess what? I know for a fact it's not you. Cartman sneered back. Kyle tried not to cringe. Don't pretend you're all high and mighty, Kyle. You're just as dirty as the rest of us. I'm not dressing up in costumes and staging fights, Kyle accused. You've caused a lot of grief for the other heroes just by existing. Hey, Misty! Cartman called over to the brawling heroes. Kyle called me a hero. Kyle took the opportunity to catch him off guard, kicking the guy like he had on the bleachers, sending his lardy ass over. Only Cartman was ready this time. He grabbed Kyle's ankle with one clawed hand, nails digging into his flesh. As Kyle was thrown backwards, air leaving his lungs in a rush. His shoulders hit first, his head bouncing against the ground until he saw stars. With the force, he was sent sliding against the pavement, hoodie exposing enough of his back to become raw in places. He didn't have time to catch his breath, his phone clattering to the ground. Cartman dove for it the same minute he did, catching the so-called hero in the side of his face and hearing him screech. Kyle's fingers grazed the phone as he stretched out, but Cartman stomped on his arm. Kyle hissed, swinging his body around to try and kick the larger boy off his arm. Cartman brought his boot directly into his face. That's for the bleachers, Jew boy, Cartman hissed as Kyle snarled in pain. He was left blind as the hero picked up his phone, ringing in Kyle's ears, keeping him from understanding what was happening. He hit his head hard, adding the kick to his making everything felt fuzzy. Kyle blindly felt for his phone, not realizing what was happening. He couldn't think, he couldn't lift his head. His limbs felt heavy. Darkness at the corners of his eyes threatened to take him under. This was bad, He underestimated him. He let his guard down. He squinted in the dying sunlight, blurred vision making him sick. He forced himself up on his forearms, blood oozing from his nose and dripping off his lips as he tried to look for either Kinney or Cartman. Kinney was pinned with ice to one of the alls, cursing and thrashing as Cartman taunted him. Everything sounded like it was underwater. Where was his phone? Kyle staggered to his feet. Blood still poured from his nose. Pissed as hell. Okay, so he underestimated him. Now he was furious, and the coon had no idea what he'd started. Kyle felt along the walls to steady himself, approaching the group. Wonder saw him, looked directly at him, then quickly looked away without telling Cartman. So he didn't want to be there. Whatever weird thing was going on with him, he didn't actually want to hurt anyone. Cartman noticed Kyle anyway. He stared, freezing momentarily, when he saw the blood-covered boy with hell in his eyes. Then the next second, his own narrowed. In a quick movement, he grabbed Kinney's mask and yanked it off, something so unheard of and controversial that Wonder audibly gasped. Kyle's heart stopped. What is that, Kinney? Cartman dropped the mask and backed off a good 3 steps, eyes large and horrified for about 8 seconds. And then he laughed. Cartman howled, Wonderstrike motionless behind him in shock. You're Mysterion? He asked the blonde, who looked like he got into a brawl with a wildcat. Kinney was still fighting against Wonder's trap, and began again in earnest. Kinney, are you kidding me? Cartman was nearly in tears, but Kyle was on his way. Rage was a great motivator, and he hopped off the slight ledge, foregoing the ramp, trying to get closer, but Cartman shook a finger at him. Now hold on, you can't touch me, Cartman said with a sneer. You send that story and I'll tell everyone Mysterion is actually a poor-ass bitch from Hicktown in the mountains. I know who this is. Kyle eyed the phone in Cartman's hands. The coon tossed it to him easily, letting him try to catch it. Vision blurred, letting it hit him squarely in the arm, and falling to the ground. Kinney made a soft noise of shock, and Cartman laughed again. What's wrong, Kyle? He asked gleefully. Look at it! Look at who it is! This kid grew up in our town! A little fucking weirdo our group in a toilet of a shack and took porn to school. That's who Mysterion is. Forget me. Guess what people say when they hear Mysterion's Kenny fucking McCormick. Kyle, Kenny was asking, not even listening. Kyle, are you okay? Kyle spit blood, making both Kenny and Cartman jump for different reasons. Wonder was looking uneasy, twitching to the point of not being able to stand still. Do you think? Kyle said thickly, eyes settling on the coon for murder, that I'm going to let you endanger him? My dad's a fucking lawyer, with law buddies all over the fucking country. I've got the resources and the money to dig Ken out of any hole I need to. Do you, fat ass? You got someone to dig you out of your coffin I'm gonna bury you in? Cartman's smile twitched slightly, turning into more of a grimace. So you already knew? He sounded disappointed. You're in love with a dirty little slut boy, Kyle? Oh, trust me. I love Kenny, Kyle said coolly, crouching to reach his phone, keeping eye contact in case he was attacked. Wonder was staring with wide eyes at Kyle and wasn't moving. And you know me, so ask yourself this. Are you going to tangle someone I love in your little fucking spiderweb? I'll fucking bury you and you know it. I got tons of followers, the coon pointed out, reddening. People like Wonder here. You think you're gonna get rid of me that easily? So you've got a little following, Kyle sneered, picking up the phone and smearing blood on the screen as he unlocked it. Well, guess what? After all this time, nothing has changed. He'd wanted to confront this asshole for years. Kyle slowly stood, keeping eye contact. All three pairs watched. You might have the cops in your pocket, but I have power, Kyle threatened. People know me. They trust me. They hang on to everything I say. Whether they agree or not, I have power, money, popularity. Everything you never have and nothing you'll never be. So ask yourself, who they're going to believe. Kyle went to his email without looking away, having to tap several times to open it. You're a fat fucking loser from the same hick town. And no one is going to care enough to drag your ass back out of this. We'll all fucking celebrate. Cartman made too many enemies. The rest of the kids grew up. He never did. Right now, he was bright red and furious, staring Kyle down as if he could kill him with looks alone. With a crack, the ice parted, letting a bruised and beaten Kenny slide to the ground, still watching Kyle, looking at him with something intense, focused and far away all at once. Behind Cartman, Wonderstrike was starting to look pissed. Cartman whirled, but not for Wonder. Kyle knew he was coming for him. He had a split second to make a choice, and he made it. He sent the message and smirk. He heard Cartman swear he was dead. Cartman took him literally to the ground. Kyle felt the stinging of ice under him, realizing that Wonderstrike had tried to soften the blow this time, with snow. It didn't stop the claws, and his phone stripped from his hand in order to block. He felt the claws dig into his arm, one catching on his neck and slicing through his skin. Despite the pain and the worsening situation, Kyle pushed up anyhow, hoping to get him off. Cartman screeched as he was dragged back, and Kyle struggled to sit up. Blackness was back in his vision, but this was different. Something was dragging Cartman along the ground. Something cloaked in darkness and wafted like smoke. It let him go, and the next second Kenny was standing in front of them, though Kyle never saw him move. He froze, sitting stupidly, curls soaked with blood and stuck to his forehead as Kenny grabbed Cartman by the throat. You don't touch Kyle! The weird tilt to his voice was back, turning Kenny's light and airy voice into something demonic, something that rumbled along the ground like an earthquake. Do not touch Kyle! Don't talk to Kyle! Don't even ever look at him again, you pathetic waste of life! Kenny's figure was even wrong. Some sort of casted glow over his body and darkness everywhere. I'll kill you! I'll rip you apart, and you can see how many people you can hurt and blackmail with your parts lying all over the concrete! Kyle couldn't hardly see anything. He blindly stumbled to his feet, not entirely sure he wasn't hallucinating this. He couldn't see the ground, the sky. He could see the glow around Mysterion, the silhouette of Cartman screaming on the ground, and someone nearly tackling him to his left side. He realized it was Wonderstrike. who looked as surprised to see Kyle as Kyle was to see him. "What's going on?" Kyle asked, and Wonder squawked, "You know better than I could!" he said incredulously, an involuntary noise slipping past his lips. He looked over Kyle critically. "Ugh, I'm shit at healing, but come here." "Gotta stop Ken," Kyle protested, shaking his hand. Something like snakes skittered across the ground, making it difficult to move. "Why?" Wonder asked sharply. Kyle stared. The boy stared back fiercely, but he didn't make any move to stop Kyle. "Because I have to," he said almost crossly. "Whatever Cartman's got on you, I'll help you. Stick around and help clean up afterwards." Wonder grunted in assent, and Kyle stumbled forward, bogged back by his own physical suffering and the darkness itself. "Kenny!" he called, wincing at the loudness of his own voice. "For fuck's sake!" he whispered to himself. What was happening? What was this? This had to be Kenny. But Mysterion didn't have powers like this. Not that he knew. "Mysterion!" A snap, and something yanked him forcefully, and suddenly he ran straight into the cloaked man. Kenny was almost unrecognizable. He melded into the shadows. Kyle was staring right in his face and almost couldn't see him. It was difficult to explain, and the brain damage he was probably facing didn't help. What he could see was the expression on his face. Enraged was an understatement. Whatever this darkness was, this is what Kenny meant. Mysterion's dark side was power, darkness, death. Kyle could feel it, was breathing it, could taste it. He said nothing at first, mind whirling through his choices. Kenny was a physical person. He was already touching him. He merely slipped his arm around and tugged him closer. He felt Kenny exhale. "It's fine," Kyle told him. "I'm fine. You're fine. Let him go." Kenny started to relax, the snapping tension of his body melting away as he began to lean against Kyle. It was so easy in the end. Mysterion sank against Kyle, reaching out for him, the darkness dissipating as he let Kyle pull him away from all of this. "You kept me upright," Kyle recalled Kenny saying. "Your outlook on life was different. You kept Mysterion from being what everyone said he was." He genuinely needed a friend. Kenny let go of grudges, moved on, forgave. But Mysterion was an entirely different animal. Everything negative, angry, and dark seemed to make up who he was. Because he was Kenny, Mysterion did good things. Crossed the line, however, and Kyle could understand how Kenny would worry about things getting away from him. Kyle twisted his fingers into the cape, Kenny causing a bit of pain with how hard he was crushing his ribcage. "Way to go, hero," Kyle lightly jabbed, murmuring into his ear. "Just ease up on the death and darkness a bit, will you?" Kenny snorted, and Kyle opened his eyes to notice he was able to see everything around him again. Cartman was shaking on the ground in shock. Wonder was standing by, pale, ready and waiting in case things went south for Kyle. Kenny loosened his grip slightly, and Kyle didn't want to hear whatever stupid apology was about to come out of his mouth. Kind of forgetting he was more or less covered in blood, Kyle turned his face and kissed him. His split lip burned, but Kenny didn't seem to hesitate in kissing him back. And it was good. It was better. Kenny's hands ended up in his hair and Kyle's arms around his waist, and things were finally okay. He didn't even know how he knew. He was dizzy and proud of himself, and kind of riding the adrenaline high of it all. This honestly left him feeling a bit crazy, but Kenny was warm again, familiar, and kissing him. It was all okay for right now. Kenny realized the state Kyle was in. The other boy a little too fuzzy to have noticed much of anything at the moment. "Shit! Dude! You're a mess!" Kenny's voice came out from under the hood, all concern. "Yeah, I need to go to the hospital, probably," Kyle agreed, looking around for his phone. Kenny's arm was on his waist now, supportive just in case. "Unlike you, I actually know when to admit that." "The police are coming," Wonder said, coming up behind them with Kenny's mask and handing it to him. We can sneak out the back way. The hospital's around the corner. No, Kyle said, interrupting Kenny before he could even speak. Both men stared at him. Cartman made a big mistake. Kyle grinned, green eyes hazy, but smile sharp. Leave me here. Let me talk to them. You two go. No way, Kenny said at the same time as Wonderstrike shook his head. Trust me on this, Ken. Kyle didn't have the energy to argue right now, but he'd damn well try if Kenny wanted to push. Besides, I think Wonder might need some help. Kenny glanced at the other hero, who looked wary. They'll rush me to the hospital, Kenny. You'd probably slow me down. Both of you get out now. Wonderstrike glanced at Mysterion, clearly letting him make the call. The boy looked about as enthused as chopping a limb off. Maybe a little less, he'd get a new one. But he leaned down, quickly pressing a kiss to Kyle's forehead, and soothing back his curls. Sit down, he ordered, and let them come to you. Keep your phone, text me when you can. I don't need another mother, Kyle said as he sat down anyhow. Kenny dropped his phone into his lap, and both heroes made it out moments before the police pulled up to the gate. Kyle waited, deciding he was suddenly too ill to speak or pass out or something as soon as they were close. He'd wait to be questioned in the safety of the hospital, in case the cops were crooked. You know, reporting was fun. Maybe he'd go into it full time. Kyle groggily opened his eyes late the next evening, curled up in his own bed, with a fan humming above his bed. He blinked slowly, head heavy and body exhausted. He wasn't even out of bed yet. The hospital. He glanced at his wrist, lifting the surprisingly heavy limb. It ached, shooting pain up his arm as he tentatively wiggled his fingers. The cast almost went to his elbow, hot, itchy, and a reminder that, yeah, that had been real, and so were the stitches on his other arm. That's why they had to use a removable cast. His arms had been scratched to shit. The nick on his chest had only needed surgical glue. He remembered hearing how he had to be carefully put under for surgery, checked for head injuries numerous times before being allowed to actually get the middle placed in his arm, being forced oxygen for some reason. Tiredly staying overnight, unable to sleep more than a few minutes at a time. Surrounded by noise and light and pain. Damned Cartman. The next morning, having to go through interrogation, hearing Cartman would be charged for assault. What Kyle had spun as an accumulation of everything that had happened in school. Hoping Kenny made an alibi for where he was that night. Maybe Cartman was going to squeal one day. No matter how terrified he was in that moment, he'd never keep his mouth shut. He wasn't the type. Something clicked sleepily in the back of his head. Shit, he'd been so exhausted this afternoon after getting home, put his shirt on inside out. Wrinkling his nose, he winced as he sat up fully. He'd been exhausted and almost out of it all last night. But Kyle gritted his teeth, pushing his haphazardly draped blankets out of the way and standing. His bare feet made his trek over the carpet silent. He pushed the door open with his good hand. Curled up on the couch, wrapped in the same blankets he had been all those months ago, slept Kyle's ride home earlier that day. Someone who had an equally difficult time sleeping, and immediately showed up when Kyle texted him, who, somehow, had obtained his own fucking keys and drove Kyle home in his own car. Kyle slowly walked across the floor, moving to the couch next to the sleeping boy. Kenny's lashes twitched slightly, his face making barely noticeable ticks as he dreamed. Kyle swallowed, ignoring the pain in his arm, to crouch. This boy was Mysterion. The alter ego he had, the person he had when he wasn't Mysterion, had always been Kenny, a boy who grew up in Kyle's neighborhood, who fought life tooth and nail all the way, and still came out of it wanting to help. Someone tough and motivated, but laid back and sensitive. Someone who came to Kyle for help, for advice, for friendship. He remembered being fixated on noticing he had pale lashes under the mask, smeared with makeup to blur the image of a face, anything human. Those lashes looked orange now, catching the setting sun. Kenny breathed deeply, slowly, wrapped in Kyle's blanket. The fact that Kenny had been Mysterion was more of a shock than disappointment. If he'd been straightforward, Kyle would have seen himself freaking out for different reasons. So maybe he was a fanboy at one point. Kyle reached up to touch his face. Unlike last time, he touched his face without being smacked away. Kenny did wake, however, multi-blue eyes catching Kyle's almost immediately. He took another breath, more deliberate this time, the sleepiness draining from his expression. They looked at each other. Kyle soothed back Kenny's hair. "How's your arm?" Kenny asked, like he was trying not to hurt him any further with just his voice. "Hurts like hell," Kyle replied, keeping his hand still on the blonde locks. Kenny didn't tell him to stop, and yeah, he was kind of sitting next to his boyfriend, sort of, as well as his proclaimed hero, in a shirt that showed the seams and a pair of shorts. But Kenny never looked away from his eyes. Never stopped staring at Kyle, like he was the most enchanting thing to cross his path, rather than the other way around. "I'm sorry," Kenny whispered, eyes intense and honest, "for all of this." "Yeah, you're only responsible for part of it," Kyle said, moving to lovingly cart his fingers back through the hair. "I made this decision." "You got hurt." Kyle saw Kenny start to slide down to a slope of self-deprecation, in an impressive amount of ways, all of which I'll get over, Kyle said coolly. "So don't play this game. I'll go right down to the station and beat Cartman up myself, just for kicks. I don't regret a second." A twisted sort of smile curved Kenny's lips, like he was smiling against his will. "You," he began, trailing off with fondness apparent in his eyes. Kyle smiled himself, gently scratching against Kenny's scalp. The other boy exhaled audibly, leaning into the touch. "So," Kyle kept brushing his hair. "So," Kenny murmured, sounding resigned. "Where do you even begin?" "What was that?" Kyle asked, fingers brushing over his forehead. "You took Cartman down, Kenny, like nothing I'd ever seen before." Kenny winced, biting his lip. "Kyle, there are things Mysterion never told you." "Would you tell me now if I asked you?" Kyle interrupted him, making Kenny regard him oddly. "Yes," he said slowly, like it was obvious. That was enough. "Then we'll get to that," he said, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. Kenny was still trying to connect the dots, or else was afraid to believe the picture he was getting. Kyle gritted his teeth and shifted so he was leaning against the couch, close enough to feel the soft breaths of air against his collarbone as Kenny breathed. Kenny's lies had knocked things out of balance, but now they were back. Kyle was the one injured, sure, but he stood shoulder to shoulder with Kenny, and they both ended up okay. Kenny never meant to be malicious, never meant to actually deceive Kyle for a darker reason. He could let go. Kyle leaned over, giving Kenny a chance to protest if he wanted. He didn't. Kenny kissed Kyle, propping himself up slightly on his arms, relief and delight almost tangible through lip contact. One hand curled into his hair, he sighed against Kyle's lips, relaxing at last almost a full day after the showdown. "I would have chose Kenny over Mysterion," Kyle found himself saying, like the words were bursting to get out. Kenny smiled against his lips, pulling Kyle back. "I know," he said, breathless, nuzzling his nose against Kyle. "You did, and you went back for me, actually. You still wanted to protect me." "Of course I did." Kyle's good hand was soothingly brushing against his cheek. "You were my friend." "You called me." Kenny sounded almost anguished, focusing again on the boy. "You sent me a text message. You called me. You wanted me. You wanted my help. You trusted me. And I'm so sorry." "Do I look mad?" Kyle asked, ironically with a drop of irritation. A quick laugh escaped the other boy. "You always look mad," he teased affectionately, blue eyes soft as Kenny scoffed. In all seriousness, dude, it doesn't matter if you're angry or not. Kyle leaned down to rest his head against Kenny's. The blonde's arm slipped up to half-hug him slightly. I was right, Kenny said quietly, voice laced with warmth. You are definitely the hero type. That made Kyle laugh involuntarily, feeling a bit jittery. Kenny pressed soft kisses to his cheek, trying to pull Kyle further into the couch. Easy, Kyle murmured, even though he moved to sit next to him. I'm sewn back together here. Kenny motioned to look at Kyle's cast wrist, pressing against it and holding it carefully. You're just missing the superpowers. If I could gift you regeneration, I've had worse. Kyle interrupted him again in his downward spiral. It was worth it to see the absolute horror on Cartman's face. I'll take it. Kenny snorted softly, gently holding his wrist. He looked thoughtful, chewing his lip. Kyle waited. Kenny let go of his wrist, slowly moving to sit up. Careful not to jostle Kyle. I'm going to tell you everything, Kenny promised, all earnest in his promise. I mean it. It doesn't have to be today. Kyle gently told him, feeling warm. We did get out of a fight with a villain after all. Yeah. Kenny smiled to himself slightly, something more Mysterion in his expression. Kyle raised an eyebrow. What'd you do with Wonderstrike? That, Kenny said, coming back to the present with a sharp look, is an interesting story. You know how Cartman was trying to amass a group of heroes under his direction? Cartman couldn't direct a pigeon home. Kyle felt the satisfaction at putting him down at this point. His body ached. Was Wonder part of it? Yeah, you know how people were saying Wonder and Superstrike were cute together? And people started to get weird about it? Kenny raised his eyebrows. Either I'm one of those people, or this definitely isn't platonic. Cartman had Superstrike under his group and more or less blackmail Wonder, who hates him, by the way. I think you'll like this guy, into staying away from Super. Only, Kenny continued, eyes lit with fire. Wonder decided to sacrifice how his friend, peer, coworker, boyfriend saw him by telling him to stay away from Cartman regardless. Wonder thinks his partner would listen to his accusations and just leave? Kyle marveled over this, as if walking up to a buddy and saying, that friend you're with is shit, would be encountered with a reply of, oh shit, really? Bye. And that was it. That wasn't the case, he could personally attest. As I said, not very platonic. Kenny's voice was serious. Mysterion shone all over his face. His determination, his deceptiveness, analyzing everything he saw. It only had been Kenny to begin with. An aspect of Kenny's personality that built Mysterion, not the other way around. So Cartman threatened Superstrike's life, and Wonder dropped everything. But he doesn't know where the Coon headquarters were, and Super's been out of the spotlight for ages. He knows nothing of his personal identity, or even what part of town he lives in. He wants some help. He's concerned. Oh, a slow smile spread over Kyle's face, fire lighting in his green eyes. Do you want someone to help you with that? He asked, raising an eyebrow. A smile curved Kenny's lips as well, and the affection melted away with calm indifference. Well, I don't want you physically out there, of course, but you're still the smartest person I know. And anyway, his smile tightened, and he grasped Kyle's hand with real warmth. Mysterion needs you. I need you. I want you here. I want to work it out. If you want that too. Kenny's babbling was endearing, and Kyle pressed their foreheads together. It was difficult to focus on Kenny this way, but he was warm and real and radiating joy. Kyle could bask in it forever. Yes, I do, he replied, and Kenny's arms began to wrap around his shoulders. I spent months worrying over you, and you made me spend weeks falling in love with you again. The very least you can do is let me help you now. Kenny made a noise between a laugh, a squeal, and a snort, hiding his face in Kyle's neck, and the hybrid sound made Kyle grin. Ages of worrying over him. Kyle wasn't exaggerating. Kenny really didn't have anyone else to lean on. When it came to superhero stuff, neither did Kyle. He and Kenny were it. and they were going to work through the slog they created, and they were going to have each other's backs the entire time. Kyle was finally going to delve into the world of superheroes like he'd always wanted, and as Kenny's partner. "I think I'm going to have a lot more fun this upcoming semester," Kyle said, resting his cheek against Kenny's hair. "I think the city's going to have some new heroes kicking some serious butt," Kenny replied happily, against his skin just above his t-shirt collar. "But not today." Kyle brushed the nape of Kenny's neck, feeling the other nuzzle closer. No, not today. But the city would wait for them. Crime wasn't in a hurry, and Mysterion could emerge from a short hiatus as a self-proclaimed hero, working alongside numerous other heroes, and even an ex-villain at one point. And people would still gossip in the papers, would whisper behind their hands, that Mysterion had a mastermind behind him, someone with their finger on the city's pulse, an unstoppable team, a hero and his peer, his companion, his friend. Whatever he was, he remained as quiet and deadly as Mysterion's shadow, and the city caved under their shared footsteps.